The news of Daenerys Targaryen's return to the shores of Westeros spread like a firestorm through the Seven Kingdoms, whispered at the hearths of fishermen's huts along the fingers, murmured beneath the towering ramparts of the Eyrie, and carried on the stinging salt winds that curled around the ports of White Harbor. No one could quite recall such a moment when an exiled queen appeared at the head of armies and dragons, determined to reclaim a birthright that had been denied to her family for decades. From the very first step she took on Dragonstone's ancient causeway, the fortress's gates flung wide to welcome a Targaryen home, and it seemed the stones themselves hummed in recognition of her presence, as though the very citadel had been awaiting her return across countless years. A hush fell on her retinue the moment she set foot on the age-scarred battlements. Those who followed her felt, or so they claimed later, a pulse in the stones beneath their feet, a slow, steady thrumming that mimicked a dragon's heartbeat. It was an omen, they said, that this woman who dared call herself the mother of dragons might well be bound to a fate larger than any mortal design. Daenerys knew in the pit of her stomach that she was home. Yet home could be a precarious foundation. For all that the castle recognized her blood, the Seven Kingdoms were hardly prepared to prostrate themselves before the child of a fallen king. She would have to prove her claim, prove her strength, prove her capacity to rule. Already rumors buzzed through the small folk and noble houses alike. She possessed 3 living dragons, fully grown, creatures of fire and scale that soared over the narrow sea and made short work of those who dared oppose her. She had forged alliances across the Slaver's Bay, overturning the cities that had once thrived on the commerce of human suffering. She carried titles long enough to fill a parchment scroll, breaker of chains, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Unburnt. And now she was poised to carve her legend into the very bedrock of Westeros. Still, there was a night chill to the air, subtle at first, easily mistaken for the everyday cold that lurked on these northern waters. But as days passed and reports filtered in from the far north, the chill became more pronounced, a silent harbinger that sent every soul on Dragonstone's ramparts peering uneasily over their shoulders. Word drifted south of a growing darkness beyond the wall, of a cold so cruel it seemed drawn from the marrow of the earth. Men whispered of whites and white walkers, of an ancient being known only as the Night King. He was said to be inhuman, or something more than human, leading an army of the dead in an unrelenting march that would freeze the blood of mortal men. Daenerys would stand late at night on the ramparts, the sea wind whipping silver-blonde strands of hair into her face, and she would think about this rumored threat. Some nights she thought she could feel an answering chill seep through her skin, a cold reminiscent of a 1,000-year winter, as though the presence of this Night King touched even the black stone of Dragonstone from across half a continent. She received counsel from her most trusted advisors, Tyrion Lannister among them, who insisted that if the living could not band together, they might all be lost. But Daenerys was a queen now in truth, not just in aspiration. She had to tread carefully, balancing her desire to save the realm with the pressing need to secure her own position. She had landed in Westeros for a reason, to claim the Iron Throne. To achieve this, she needed to defeat Cersei Lannister and break the power of those who clung stubbornly to the old ways. Yet something about these reports weighed upon her more than any political consideration. Perhaps it was a faint echo of prophecy, or maybe a stirring in her blood. After all, she was the mother of dragons, living flame incarnate. A part of her, some fervent corner of her soul, wondered if she had been shaped by fate specifically to confront a darkness that no other power could withstand. For what could stand against an army of ice and death but an army of fire and life? Or perhaps even just one woman burning bright enough to set the world aflame? Late one night, she dreamed of a great, dim hall lit only by flickering torches. Beneath her feet, she felt hoarfrost creeping across the floor, licking at her ankles. From the other side of the hall came the scrape of something dragging on stone, a slow, methodical sound that set her heart hammering. She saw no figure, only a deeper darkness that moved against the gloom, a shape defined by the cold. Then, from an unseen corner, she felt a rush of sudden heat behind her, and turned to find herself face to face with a reflection in a mirror made of obsidian. The reflection was herself, but wreathed in flames that flickered along her hair like living serpents. Her eyes glowed a molten gold, and her skin bore the shadows of dragon scales shifting beneath the surface. She turned back, and the shape that was the Night King stood across from her, eyes like shards of blue ice that threatened to devour the light. Awaking with a start, Daenerys tasted salt on her lips, uncertain whether she had wept or simply dreamt the spray of winter seas. The dream lingered in her mind for days. When Jon Snow arrived at Dragonstone to plead for aid, to beg her to set aside her war against Cersei just long enough to confront the looming threat of the dead, Daenerys listened carefully. They had clashed at first, both stubborn in their convictions. Yet in the quiet corners of the castle, when the embers of the hearth turned to ash and the candles sputtered, she found a sense of kinship with him. Jon had faced the Night King, had seen the truth of the threat. He carried an unshakable determination that flared with desperation. He was a man who had already sacrificed everything to save his people. She saw that, in a sense, they walked parallel paths. He had been named king in the north by his lords, while she had come to claim the Iron Throne by right of birth. Yet both were outsiders in their own way, bearing burdens heavier than any mortal soul shouldered. It comforted her in a manner she could not easily articulate to know she was not alone in believing that something greater than petty squabbles over crowns was rising in the north. Gradually he won her over to the urgency of his cause, or perhaps she had been inclined to it from the start. Her armies, her dragons, the entire might of House Targaryen reborn, she would marshal it all, but first she must confirm the truth. Through the combined cunning of her allies and Jon's men, they captured a white and brought it to the southern lords. The demonstration was fearsome enough to stir real terror in those gathered, yet Cersei's promises of an alliance rang hollow. Daenerys was not fooled. She sensed the Lannister queen's duplicity, but time was too short to unravel the labyrinth of southern politics. The real test lay beyond the wall, in the white waste of the northern lands, where a cold more ancient than memory marched relentlessly forward. And so Daenerys rode north. The trip tested even her resolve. The further she traveled, the colder the nights became, the more often the gloom pressed against her thoughts, as if the distant presence she had felt from Dragonstone intensified with every mile. Her dragons soared above her, but even they seemed uneasy, roaring at the empty sky as though searching for some hidden enemy. That was the first time Tyrion voiced an odd observation in the half-joking, half-serious manner he used to mask true concern. "Your Grace," he said, "it's as though you've taken on the role of the Night King's opposite number. Where he brings the cold and the dark, you bring heat and light. Let us only hope your warmth prevails." His words kindled a spark in her mind, a notion that perhaps was not entirely new. The dream of that dark hall returned to her thoughts, the image of herself aflame in the obsidian mirror. Could it be that the Lord of Ice and Death had a counterpart in the Lady of Fire and Life? She pushed the thought away. Hers was a human cause, she told herself. She was not a god, not a spirit of flame, no matter what the Red Priests whispered about Azor Ahai reborn. She was Daenerys Storborn, a woman who had suffered and bled, who had lost everything and clawed her way back to power. She refused to be cast into some cosmic drama where men would forget her humanity. And yet, as they drew closer to Winterfell, she could not entirely shake the sense that fate itself was weaving a tapestry around her, drawing threads of ice and fire into a pattern older than the Valyrian freehold or the First Men. Winterfell was a fortress of stone and wood, but beneath it natural hot springs ran, keeping the halls warmer than most in the north. Even so, the chill seeped in through every crevice. The moment Daenerys beheld the castle with snow drifting from an overcast sky and the great courtyard filled with men and women busy with the tasks of war, she realized the scale of what lay ahead. She was welcomed formally if cautiously by the Lady of Winterfell, Sansa Stark. The tension between them was palpable, though moderated by Jon's presence. They were preparing for a siege unlike any in living memory. Blades of dragonglass had been forged from the raw lumps that Daenerys had allowed Jon to mine at Dragonstone. The black shards glittered in weapon racks, daggers, arrowheads, spear tips, and swords. Beneath the lamplight, they seemed to drink in the glow rather than reflect it, as though absorbing the promise of fire within them. That evening, a council was called in the great hall. Voices rose, tempers flared. Many doubted the old tales, believed it impossible that the dead truly walked. Others, who had faced the whites at Harhome or along the frozen lakes, spoke of unspeakable horrors. Daenerys said little, her mind racing through strategies, alliances, the distribution of her forces. Grey Worm and the Unsullied stood by the walls, disciplined and stoic. Nearby, the Dothraki horse lords paced like caged predators, their eyes flicking impatiently to the windows where the endless swirl of snow seemed to mock their memories of sun-baked seas of grass. Tyrion observed everything with the quiet calculation of a man who recognized that words were weapons as keen as swords, but even his quick mind found no easy solution. Bran Stark, the boy who had become something far stranger than a mere lord, offered cryptic insights that made the hair on the back of Daenerys's neck prickle. Then the horns sounded from the ramparts, long and mournful, echoing down the corridors like the wail of ghosts. The entire hall erupted into motion. Men scrambled for armor, women carried children to safety, and Daenerys caught Jon's eye. She knew, without words, that the time for careful planning had passed. The enemy was here. The dead marched beyond the gates, a vast army that stretched across the snowy plains. From the battlements, by the light of flickering torches and braziers, she saw them, thousands upon thousands of wights, once human, now drained of life, their eyes glowing with unearthly malice. At their head loomed figures on skeletal horses, white walkers whose very presence emanated a cold so profound it seemed to still the wind. And behind them, overshadowing all, a silhouette with glowing blue eyes. The Night King. Daenerys felt her pulse thunder in her ears. She had faced slavers, warlords, kings, and queens, but never the embodiment of a cosmic chill. She hurried down the stairs, her voice echoing off the stone walls as she shouted commands. She could see the Unsullied snapping into formation, the Dothraki lighting their araks with oil-soaked rags. She felt Drogon and Rhaegal in her mind, sensed Viserion's absence like a phantom pain. Viserion was gone, taken by the Night King, she'd heard, used as a corpse dragon to tear down the wall. Her heart ached, but she buried the pain, recalling the searing fury that had claimed her when she discovered her child had been perverted by death. She was not a goddess, but in that moment, Daenerys almost believed that her wrath might be strong enough to melt the very snows that threatened to bury them. Jon found her in the courtyard, both of them clad in thick furs. He gripped her hand for a fraction of a second. "Our scouts say they'll attack by nightfall," he said, his face pale but resolute. "You should use your dragons. Torch the dead before they reach the walls." She nodded, but an inner voice, one she seldom heard, cautioned her. "Something tells me he wants that," she said quietly, casting a glance at the swirling gloom. Even as she spoke, distant lightning flickered across the sky, bluish eerie, as though some monstrous storm had been summoned. "He took Viserion from me once. He wants to lure me into a trap." Jon set his jaw. "We stand better odds with your dragons in the air." They hurried toward the makeshift dragon pit outside the castle, where Drogon and Rhaegal crouched amidst drifting snow. Each beast rose, huffing clouds of steam into the freezing air. As Daenerys approached, Drogon lowered his massive head, nuzzling her shoulder with surprising gentleness. She remembered the day he first let loose his flame at her command, how she had felt an almost electric surge of destiny then, as though her life had been forged for that singular purpose. Now that same sense welled within her, but sharper, more urgent. She swung onto Drogon's back, the heat from his body driving away the worst of the chill. Across from her, Rhaegal roared, allowing Jon to climb into a saddle. They launched into the sky. The wind howled around them, and as they circled the castle's battlements, Daenerys glimpsed the shimmer of dragonglass weaponry bristling on the walls. Soldiers with hearts pounding in their chests braced for the onslaught. To the north, that roiling mass of the dead moved steadily closer, white as the flurries that surrounded them. Winterfell's defenders had built trenches lined with sharpened stakes, prepared burning pitch, and stationed archers with flaming arrows. But deep down, Daenerys knew that all these fortifications would matter little if they could not break the Night King's hold. This was not just a battle of men. It was a battle of primeval forces, and she felt inexorably drawn to the center of it. Swooping low, Daenerys directed Drogon to unleash a torrent of flame upon the first ranks of the whites. Fire illuminated the darkening sky, turning it orange and gold, and for an instant, it looked as if dawn had come early. The snow melted in wide swaths, sending up clouds of steam, and countless whites disintegrated into ash. But for every line of the dead she destroyed, more lurched forward. She glimpsed Jon guiding Rhaegal in a similar pattern, scorching a path around the outer flank. The White Walkers barely flinched at the destruction of their lesser minions. Their icy gaze remained fixed on the dragons as though expecting them. Then she saw it, a shape in the sky, dark wings beating heavily with a frost-laced aura clinging to its hide. Viserion. Undead, twisted by the Night King's sorcery, the once proud dragon soared across the battlefield, exhaling a stream of icy blue flame that froze men in an instant. Daenerys' heart seized at the sight of her lost child. She urged Drogon upward, chasing after Viserion. She had once believed dragons could not be corrupted, that they were living embodiments of fire's supremacy over ice, but here was proof to the contrary. The Night King could twist even dragons to his will. Drogon roared, a deafening blast of rage. There was no kinship left between these creatures, only the fury of life against death. Viserion's ghostly flame met Drogon's inferno in midair, creating a clash of swirling energies that crackled with unnatural tension. Daenerys felt the hairs on her arms stand on end. For a moment, the lines of battle blurred. Winter storm and living fire contended, turning the battlefield below into a spectacle of swirling steam and flickering shadows. Soldiers cheered wildly whenever Drogon's flame pressed the undead dragon back, then gasped in horror when the cold blast advanced again. Daenerys clung to the saddle, focusing her will. She refused to lose Drogon, refused to yield to the creature that had stolen Viserion. Her eyes narrowed, tears freezing on her lashes as she thought of the sweet, scaly hatchling Viserion had once been, the gentle rumble of his purr when he nestled beside her on quiet nights in Meereen. Now he was a monstrosity bound to the Night King's will. Somewhere in the frigid gloom, that being with the blue eyes was watching her, orchestrating every move. She broke away, guiding Drogon into a steep dive that brought them within range of the White Walkers. They seemed to sense her approach, scattering into columns of freezing mist. Drogon's flame lashed out, carving a path of molten snow and burning corpses. The screams of the Whites filled the air, but the White Walkers stood, unburnt, their cold magic forging a barrier. For an instant, Daenerys feared that even dragon fire might not be enough. Then one of them raised a spear of ice and hurled it. The projectile whistled past Drogon's flank, narrowly missing his wing membrane. She felt an urgent fear clamp around her chest. Viserion had fallen to a spear of ice, and she knew how deadly it could be. Jon soared overhead on Regal, weaving between blasts of freezing flame from Viserion. The night sky crackled with lightning and savage roars, as though the very heavens were at war. Below, Winterfell's defenders fought valiantly, but the tide of the dead pressed closer and closer. The trenches ignited in roaring flames where pitch was poured, stalling the forward ranks, but not stopping them entirely. The White Walkers, with the fluid grace of predators, stepped around the flames, commanding the Whites to surge in from the flanks. The courtyard of Winterfell descended into chaos. Men and women shouted, steel clashed against brittle bones, and the stench of death mingled with the reek of burning flesh. Somewhere within those tumultuous shadows, Daenerys caught a glimpse of the Night King himself. He was astride Viserion, having leapt onto the undead dragon's back at some moment she had not noticed. Their eyes locked across the distance. For an endless heartbeat, she felt him studying her. The dream she had experienced on Dragonstone flickered through her mind. She recalled that image of an obsidian mirror, of herself in flames, and of that icy silhouette on the far side. And now here they were, each astride a dragon, each representing a force that reached beyond mortal comprehension. The wind howled, and she felt a deep, unsettling resonance. This was not just any battle. It was a struggle that might define the fate of the entire world, or so it felt in the marrow of her bones. With a silent command, the Night King guided Viserion forward. The undead dragon bore down on Drogon, unleashing that chilling blue flame. Daenerys steeled herself, though she could do nothing but brace in the saddle and trust Drogon's reflexes. Fire met ice in a flash of steam and crackling sparks. In that clash, she felt a wave of numbing cold wash over her. Her teeth clenched, and she tasted blood on her lip where she bit down. It took every ounce of her will not to be flung from Drogon's back. Slowly, agonizingly, Drogon's fire forced Viserion's deadly breath away. Viserion shrieked, a sound warped by necrotic magic, and beat his massive wings to gain altitude. That was when Daenerys realized the Night King was standing on Viserion's back, spear of ice in hand, every muscle in her body tensed. She remembered how helpless she'd felt when he threw that cursed lance at Viserion on the frozen lake. She could not allow him to do the same to Drogon. With a ferocious cry, she urged Drogon forward, daring to close the distance. The swirling sleet pelted her face, but she forced her eyes to remain open. She had faced down slavers, crucified masters, burned foes who threatened her children. This was just another enemy, albeit one draped in ancient, terrifying power. She had to face him. Drogon snapped his jaws, and she felt the rush of scorching air as he expelled a concentrated column of flame. It engulfed Viserion's head and neck. For a moment, Daenerys allowed herself to hope that the fire might burn away the necromancy chaining him. But though Viserion's scales blackened in places and flesh sloughed off to reveal bone, the undead dragon pushed through, half its visage now a gruesome ruin of charred sinew. The Night King stood untouched by the flame, shielded by some glacial aura that parted the fire around him. His eyes, glowing a baleful blue, pinned Daenerys with an unholy stare. And then he hurled the ice spear. Tom seemed to slow. She felt Drogon twist, felt his muscles convulse beneath her. The spear grazed his shoulder before whirling off into the darkness. A shriek of pain tore from Drogon's throat, but he managed to remain airborne. Daenerys clung to the saddle, her knuckles white as they spun wildly. Far below, she could make out the courtyard now overrun by whites. Screams rang out. The living were being pushed back, forced into pockets of desperate resistance. Through the swirl of snow, she saw flickers of red flame, Melisandre, or perhaps another priest, chanting spells of fire to hold the line. Archers fired volley after volley of dragonglass-tipped arrows into the swarm, and the clang of steel rang incessantly. Winterfell was on the brink. With a massive effort, Drogon regained his balance, beating his wings to halt their plunge. Daenerys glanced at the dragon's shoulder and saw black blood oozing from the wound, the edges rimed with frost. She reached down, pressing her hand to the scales, and felt the burning heat of his life battling the encroaching chill. "Hold on," she whispered, though her words were lost in the gale. "Hold on for me." No matter the cost, she had to protect her children, had to protect all those who had placed their faith in her. Summoning the last reserves of her courage, she spurred Drogon forward once more. The Night King hovered above, the tattered wings of Viserion beating the air. Daenerys realized that unless she found a way to end this confrontation, the dead would overwhelm Winterfell, and all her dreams of breaking the wheel would become moot. Ice or fire, one must prevail. The prophecy came to her, that old riddle the Red Priests and Priestesses had whispered, Azor Ahai, the prince or princess who was promised, forged in light to stand against the darkness. She had never claimed to be a chosen savior, but in that moment she felt a bright brand of defiance blaze within her breast. She guided Drogon upward, circling around to approach Viserion from behind. The wind stung her cheeks, but she braced herself, pushing aside fear. Drogon roared, his warm breath enveloping her, reminding her that though she was but flesh and blood, she had power that no mortal woman had possessed in centuries. She was blood of the dragon. The Night King turned to face her, spear raised again, but he was too slow. Drogon's jaws snapped down on Viserion's neck, and the two dragons collided in a screeching tangle of wings, teeth, and claws. Daenerys nearly toppled from the saddle, but she clung on, hearing the rending of flesh and bone as the beasts wrestled in midair. The Night King, a figure of silent fury, swung his weapon in a desperate arc, slicing across Drogon's chest. Blood spattered the sky. But Daenerys refused to yield. She urged Drogon to release another massive gout of flame, so intense that the very air shimmered. Viserion's rotted flesh caught fire, and with a ghastly shriek, the undead dragon twisted, trying to pull free. That was when she saw an opening, though not to strike the Night King with dragonfire, for he seemed immune. Instead, she remembered what Jon had told her about obsidian weapons. She had one at her belt, a dragonglass dagger, a small thing meant for close-quarters defense. Perhaps this was madness, but she had a single chance. She unhooked herself from the saddle. The wind threatened to hurl her off Drogon's side. The creature beneath her roared, thrashing, locked in a deadly struggle with his undead brother. But she found her balance, carefully edging along Drogon's neck spines. The Night King glared at her, and she felt a wave of cold dread as he raised his icy spear. If she hesitated, if she faltered, it would all be over. She launched herself from Drogon, leaping onto Viserion's neck, her heart pounding so loudly she could scarcely hear the howling wind. The heat of Drogon's flame still raged across Viserion's decaying scales, but Daenerys ignored the pain, the fear, the heartbreak at seeing her beloved dragon turned into this horror. Clinging with one hand, she forced herself to climb closer to where the Night King stood. She could see the cracks in his icy armor, the inhuman complexion of his face. Blue eyes blazed with malice, and he raised his spear again, aiming at her heart. But she was moving too quickly, spurred by adrenaline and desperation. Daenerys drove the dragonglass dagger forward in a wild arc. He brought up his free hand, fingers like pale claws, to swat her aside. But the dagger found its mark, plunging into the gap of armor beneath his ribcage. She felt a sudden pulse of energy, as if the dagger had connected with something deeper than flesh. The Night King's eyes flared impossibly bright, and for an instant his features contorted in what might have been surprise. Or rage, or perhaps pain. Daenerys had never seen him express even the slightest emotion, but now his face twisted into a silent snarl. Time suspended. The storm seemed to pause, flakes of snow hanging in midair. The battlefield below froze in the midst of screams and clashes. Daenerys held onto the dagger, her teeth bared, refusing to let go. The Night King made no sound, but she felt a deep, resonant crack as if a glacier were splitting from within. Then shards of frost erupted from his body, fracturing outward. She wrenched the dagger free and an unearthly howl filled the air. The Night King's form shattered like glass, bursting into 1,000 pieces that caught the torchlight and dragon fire in a dazzling, deadly glitter. Viserion's decaying body jerked and with a final convulsion plummeted from the sky. Daenerys felt herself falling too, weightless, the wind rushing around her. Suddenly Drogon's massive claws closed around her, catching her moments before she would have struck the ground. She heard him grunt in pain as he struggled to hold her. They crashed onto the blood-soaked earth of Winterfell's courtyard, skidding through clusters of whites. A thunderous roar erupted from the defenders on the walls as they saw the Night King vanish and his whites crumble like puppets with their strings cut. One by one, the dead collapsed, the icy magic animating them dissolving in the wake of their master's destruction. The courtyard filled with a hush that was at once eerie and triumphant. For a span of heartbeats, Daenerys lay on the ground, stunned, dragging in ragged breaths. Her limbs shook and every nerve felt aflame with pain and cold. Drogon, wounded and bleeding, coiled around her protectively, snarling at the remnants of the undead that still twitched. Then, as if by some divine mercy, Jon emerged from the swirling snow, shouting her name. He dropped to his knees beside her, helping her sit upright. She saw tears freezing on his cheeks and realized she was weeping too, tears of grief, relief, victory, all entwined. All around them, the survivors of Winterfell stared in wonder. The White Walkers had disintegrated, their glacial forms reduced to nothing more than freezing vapor. The whites that remained were inert, collapsing into piles of bones and rotted flesh. The storm overhead began to lessen as though the winter's wrath had been momentarily sated. In the hush that followed, Daenerys felt a wave of exhaustion heavier than any she had ever known. But in the midst of that bone-deep fatigue, she sensed something else, a faint warmth spreading through the cold night air, as though the land had breathed a sigh of relief. She allowed Jon to help her to her feet. Her body ached, her clothes soaked with melting snow and dragon's blood, but she was alive. She clutched the dragonglass dagger in her hand, its tip jagged and stained with a thin layer of frost that rapidly melted. The hush broke as cheers rose from the defenders, mingled with sobs of grief for those lost. Tyrion approached, disbelief written on his face, stammering words of congratulations that sounded hollow in the face of so much death. Grey Worm and the Unsullied bowed their heads in stoic respect. Yet there was something akin to astonishment in their eyes. The Dothraki, fewer now but still fierce, flung back their heads and let out a cry of victory, although they understood that the triumph had come at great cost. Daenerys turned her gaze to the shattered remains of Viserion, the once majestic beast she had hatched from fire and blood. His broken skeleton lay half-buried in the courtyard, steaming in the cold air. She dared not approach at first, her grief and guilt too raw. Eventually, however, she forced her legs to move, each step echoing in her mind like the toll of a funeral bell. She knelt by what remained of his skull, a hollow shell that had once been brimming with life. Gently, she pressed her hand to the mottled scales. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. She felt Jon's presence behind her, offering silent comfort. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself grieve for her lost child. The hours that followed were a blur of frantic effort to tend the wounded, gather the fallen, and restore some semblance of order to Winterfell. Fires were lit in every hearth, pushing back the chill that still lingered. Daenerys could hardly stand on her feet, yet she refused to rest. She walked the battlements, speaking words of consolation to soldiers who had lost limbs or loved ones, lending what presence she could to reassure the living that the threat had passed. Everywhere she went, people looked at her with awe and a glimmer of fear. She had destroyed the Night King. She had leapt from one dragon onto another, driven a knife of obsidian into the heart of the very embodiment of death. The bards would spin songs of this night, though the realm might not fully comprehend the cost. Near dawn, when the pale sun finally broke through the gray clouds, Daenerys found herself standing in the Godswood, the quiet heart of Winterfell. The old weirwood tree, with its carved face and crimson leaves, stood as silent witness. The ground around the tree was churned with snow, footprints, and a few dark stains of blood. She gazed at the heart tree, thinking of all that had transpired, the fragile alliances made to fight a common threat, the terror of confronting an enemy that embodied primal cold. And she thought, too, of Tyrion's offhand remark. The Night King's opposite number. She had brushed that idea aside, unwilling to see herself as some cosmic force of fire. Now she could not ignore it. She had come to Westeros to break the chains of tyranny and claim the Iron Throne. Yet she had found herself in a battle that transcended mortal struggles. She knelt by the tree, pressing her palm to the roots. The bark was cool to the touch. She closed her eyes, letting her breath steady. Memories floated up of Drogo's pyre where she had first stepped into the flames and emerged unburnt with 3 dragons. Of the desert beyond the Red Waste where she had walked alone beneath the scorching sun. Of Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen where she had broken the shackles of slaves. Of the cold flight above the wall where she had tried to rescue Jon and his company only to lose Viserion. And of that final confrontation in the sky locked in mortal struggle with the Night King. A voice startled her from her reverie. He was not simply a man. She looked up to find Bran Stark, the boy-turned-raven, regarding her with those distant eyes that saw too much. He was the embodiment of the long night, Bran said softly. A power drawn from the darkness of ages past, a testament to the cruelty of winter. Some might say you are his counterpart, the champion of fire, Daenerys of the House Targaryen. She rose slowly, mindful of the throbbing ache in her limbs. I don't want that, she said, voice hushed. I never wanted to be some symbolic figure. I only wanted to make the world better, to break a system of oppression. Bran's gaze shifted to the heart tree. We do not choose the forces that move through us. We only choose how we wield them. You have been touched by fire since your birth, the storm that birthed you, the flames that spared you when Drogo's pyre burned. The night you conquered was more than just a man. You saw him shatter like ice meeting dragonfire. The old stories say that when ice and fire clash, the world changes. She bowed her head. And what now? Do I claim the throne I came here for? Do I set the 7 kingdoms in order? So many have died and I am not the same woman who landed on Dragonstone. Bran studied her with an unreadable calm. Your path is your own. You are not a god, nor are you beholden to any single destiny. But you have proven yourself a force of nature, Daenerys Stormborn. The realm has seen you for what you can be, salvation from the cold. She wanted to refute the idea, to claim she was just another mortal soul, but the memory of that final confrontation hung in her mind. Something had guided her hand, had sharpened her will. Was it merely courage? Or was there indeed some deeper significance to her birth under the bleeding star, as some followers of the Red God believed? She recalled the words of the ancient prophecy, when the red star bleeds and the darkness gathers, Azor Ahai shall be born again amidst smoke and salt. She breathed out, letting the cold morning air fill her lungs. It was too large, too complex to unravel at once. Let the singers and the priests debate the meaning. She had a realm to heal, an Iron Throne to consider, and a duty to the living that remained. Over the following days, the snows eased, as if the bitter heart of winter had been broken with the Night King's demise. Not that the season itself vanished. Westeros was still locked in winter, but the unnatural storms receded. Word spread, carried by the swiftest riders and ravens, that the Night King had been vanquished at Winterfell. Allies and rivals alike would soon converge on the battered fortress. The bodies of the fallen were burned in vast pyres, sending a final blaze of flame into the sullen sky. Daenerys stood at the edge of one such pyre, arms crossed over her chest, tears drying on her cheeks as she watched the smoky plumes ascend. She felt each life lost as a weight pressing on her heart. These had been her people, even those who had once served other houses. They were all part of the realm she sought to protect. Jon approached quietly, a worn sadness in his eyes. He bore his own scars from the battle, physically and emotionally. Gently, he placed a hand on Daenerys' shoulder. You should rest, he said. We've all earned it. She nodded but did not move. They died because they believed in me, she said, her voice hollow. Because they believed in the living. Many of them were Northerners who owed me no loyalty. And yet they fought. They died. And I killed the Night King. The words felt surreal on her tongue. She had accomplished what she hadn't even dared to dream was possible. Part of her expected to wake from a slumber. Jon's grip on her shoulder tightened slightly. You did what had to be done. We all did. Without you, none of us would be standing here. A flicker of warmth spread through her at his reassurance, but the weight remained. She forced herself to walk away from the pyre, letting her gaze wander across the courtyard where the living now worked to clean up the aftermath of that horrific night. Winterfell's walls bore new scars, cracked stone, shattered parapets, but the fortress stood. Life persisted. Men fed the surviving horses, children emerged from hidden cellars, blacksmiths resumed their tasks at the forges. She glimpsed Tyrion assisting a group of wounded men, offering them cups of water, a far cry from his usual wry jests. Grey Worm methodically organized the Unsullied, rebuilding a semblance of discipline after the terror of facing an endless horde of the undead. The Dothraki, fewer but no less fierce, patrolled the perimeter, watchful for any lingering threat. Daenerys found a moment's solace in the stables where she visited Drogon. The dragon's wounds had been bandaged as best as one could bandage a creature of his size. His black scales bore gashes rimed with dried blood and frost, but already she sensed his internal fire knitting flesh and bone. He snorted when she approached, nudging her with his massive snout. She pressed her forehead to his scaly cheek, whispering soft reassurances in High Valyrian. Even weakened, Drogon radiated a heat that eased the chill in her bones. As she lingered there, a memory rose unbidden, the image of the Night King as he shattered, the feeling of the dragonglass biting into his unnatural flesh. She recalled the dream that had plagued her on Dragonstone, the vision of herself in the obsidian mirror, ringed by flames, and that cold shape across from her. It had felt like a question or perhaps a prophecy, but it was answered now. She had proven, at least for this one crucial moment, that fire could triumph over ice. Yet the victory had tasted of ash. She inhaled slowly, reminding herself that this was not the end of her journey. The realm still trembled in the aftermath, and the Iron Throne remained contested. She would not abandon her quest to unite the kingdom, to break the wheel of tyranny, to establish a new order where the common folk were not mere playthings of the nobility. If the gods had chosen her as some champion of flame, so be it. But she would wield that mantle to do more than just defeat a single ancient evil. She would try to heal the kingdom from within. Over the next weeks, ravens arrived daily, bearing messages of shock and disbelief at the news of the Night King's demise. One by one, the lords of the north, the Vale, the Riverlands, and even some from the Westerlands sent congratulations or requests for alliances. Much of this was orchestrated by Tyrion, who seemed to find renewed purpose in forging a stable future out of the chaos. Daenerys tried to engage with these diplomatic matters but often found her mind drifting to the enormity of what had happened. Sometimes she caught men and women staring at her with reverence or dread. She remembered how certain followers of the Red God, like Kinvara and Thuras, had looked at her in Essos. Now, that same look was reflected in the eyes of northerners who once doubted her. One cold twilight found her alone on the ramparts again, leaning over the ancient stone, gazing at the horizon. Snow glittered on the battlements, though the worst of the storms had passed. The scent of wood smoke lingered, mingling with the crisp northern air. In the courtyard below, soldiers patrolled with torches, their footsteps crunching in the snow. Her breath plumed before her in little at clouds. She thought of her father, the Mad King, and how he had once sought to burn cities to preserve his rule. She thought of her brother Viserys, consumed by entitlement and bitterness, undone by his own arrogance. And she thought of herself, a breaker of chains, mother to dragons, slayer of the Night King. Would history record her as a savior or a tyrant? Her choices in the days to come would shape that legacy. A faint rustle of movement announced Jon's arrival. He stepped beside her, resting his gloved hands on the edge of the rampart. "You're awake early," he remarked. She glanced at him, noting the worry lines etched into his face. He had borne so many burdens even before she met him. This victory, at least, should grant him some peace. But war never truly left the hearts of those who survived it. "I've had trouble sleeping," Daenerys admitted. "I keep dreaming of the battle. Or of him." Jon nodded. "I see him, too, in my sleep sometimes. The way his eyes looked. Too blue. Too cold. It's hard to believe he's gone." He paused, exhaling slowly. "But you did it. You ended the threat that's haunted mankind for thousands of years." She let out a humorless laugh. "Did I? Or did fate do it through me?" He turned to face her. "Fate or not, it was your will, your strength that struck the blow. You fought for us, Daenerys. For the living." Her gaze dropped to the mortar between the stones. She wanted to find comfort in his words, but a deep unease gnawed at her. "I'm proud that I could help save so many from such a fate. But there's so much left. So many battles, even if none so great as this. People will say I'm the champion of light, that I was destined to fight the darkness. They'll place me on a pedestal." She grimaced, remembering how her followers in Essos had raised her onto their shoulders. chanting Misa, Mother. I don't want that. I only want to build a world that's better than what we've known. I don't want worship. I want peace. Jon's voice was quiet, but steady. Peace might be harder to achieve than killing the Night King. A weary smile tugged at her lips. You're right, she said. But perhaps we have a chance. The threat from the north is ended. The lords who might have opposed me might reconsider now. The people want a ruler who can protect them, not one who cowers behind walls. Her mind drifted to the south, to King's Landing, where Cersei still clung to the Iron Throne. The realm had changed overnight. The unimaginable had happened. Could Cersei's hold remain strong if the rest of Westeros rallied behind the woman who slew the Night King? Jon studied her, conflict flickering in his gray eyes. He seemed poised to speak, but then a horn sounded from the gates. They both looked down to see the portcullis rising, a cluster of riders entering the courtyard. Even at a distance, Daenerys recognized the banners. A golden lion on crimson, accompanied by a silver trout on a field of blue and red. Lannister and Tully. She exchanged a glance with Jon. It seemed the lords had arrived sooner than expected to bend the knee, or perhaps to negotiate. Another step on the road to unity or war. With a final sigh, she squared her shoulders and descended the ramparts to greet them. For days, Daenerys presided over gatherings in the Great Hall, receiving emissaries from across the Seven Kingdoms. Some came in humble thanks, bearing small gifts or sincere gratitude. Others came warily, old grievances stirring behind polite smiles. Daenerys maintained a measured poise, her expression regal and calm. Tyrion stood at her side, offering subtle commentary, a lifeline of wit and insight. Jon and Sansa acted as representatives of the North, though Sansa's trust in Daenerys had grown only slightly, tempered by the reality of the winter they had survived together. More than once, Daenerys had to remind herself that alliances forged in the heat of battle could fracture under the slightest political strain. She had to manage every conversation carefully, keeping in mind that fear might drive men to desperate acts. But behind the formalities, Daenerys sensed a shift. Whether through rumor, confirmed reports, or personal testimonies, the realm knew the truth. A power of unimaginable terror had marched upon Winterfell, and Daenerys Targaryen had shattered it. She was no longer merely a foreign invader with dragons. She was the queen who had saved them from a fate worse than death. No doubt some lords chafed at the idea of kneeling to her, but they could not deny the awe that colored their every interaction. Their eyes flicked nervously to her, as though expecting her to burst into flame at any moment. The songs had already begun, spread by traveling minstrels who had survived the battle. Daenerys the Nightbreaker, some called her, or Daenerys Stormborn, champion of fire. More than one visiting lord insisted on kissing her hand, declaring they would serve the Targaryen queen who defied death itself. It felt surreal, a heavy mantle of expectation settling on her shoulders. Daenerys accepted their fealty with as much humility as she could muster, remembering the raw terror of that night, the heartbreak of losing Viserion. She was a woman, not a goddess. She forced herself to remain grounded, to stay focused on the next steps. Letters were sent south, entreaties to House Tyrell's remnants, to Dorne, to the Stormlands, and even to the Iron Islands. She offered them peace and a place in a realm under her rule, free from the threat of the dead, and with a promise to break the old cycles of tyranny. She understood that old grudges would not vanish overnight, but hope glimmered at the edges of the horizon. Perhaps, if they recognized her not just as a conqueror, but as a liberator from an apocalyptic threat, they would find common cause. When, at last, a quiet evening arrived without a council to attend or a ceremony to conduct, Daenerys slipped away from the bustle weaving through Winterfell's corridors to the crypts. Her breath reverberated in the silence. The statues of Stark ancestors loomed on either side of the passage, their stone eyes watching as if in judgment. She carried a single candle, the flame flickering in the draught. At last, she reached the alcove where many of the more recent Starks were laid to rest. Softly, she knelt before the tomb of Lyanna Stark. She had never known the woman, but so much hinged on her story, the love that had ignited a rebellion, the secret child who grew up unaware of his true parentage. Jon's parentage. Daenerys gazed at the marble likeness of Lyanna's face. Rhaegar loved you, she whispered, and the son you bore is more honorable than any man I've known. She paused, the candlelight dancing across her features. Sometimes I wonder if our families were always meant to unite in some way, an alliance of ice and fire. But so much tragedy has stained the union. And now I've become something beyond just a queen. They call me the fire equivalent of the Night King, as if I must stand eternal vigil for the realm. I never wanted that burden. Her words faded into the hush of the crypt. She felt a strange companionship with this dead woman who had unwittingly shaped so many destinies. For a moment, Daenerys closed her eyes, letting the chill of the crypt sink into her bones. If you were here, she continued, voice softer, what would you say? Would you tell me to lay down the mantle of prophecy and be content with mortal joys? Or would you urge me to embrace it, to safeguard the realm in ways no one else can? She shook her head. I am so tired, Lyanna. I have lost a dragon, an army, dear friends. Yet I am needed more than ever. If the wheel is to be broken, it will not happen quickly or easily. Outside, winter winds moaned softly through the castle's towers. Daenerys lingered a while longer, finding in the silence a measure of resolve. When she emerged from the crypts, the corridors were dim, lit by only a few torches. The hush reminded her of her youth, wandering through deserted halls in search of some sense of belonging. But she was not alone here. She found Jon waiting near the top of the steps, leaning against a pillar. Their gazes met, and though a world of conflict lay between them, unspoken truths and burdens, they shared a quiet understanding. No matter how complicated their ties, they had fought side by side against the long night, and together they had prevailed. He asked no questions, nor did she volunteer any explanation. Instead, they walked back up into the great courtyard, where the night sky was sprinkled with stars. Snow still dusted the ground, but it no longer felt so oppressive. Fires burned in braziers along the walls, casting dancing shadows. Daenerys took comfort in those flames, seeing them not as instruments of destruction but as beacons guiding the realm through the darkness. She was the breaker of chains, the mother of dragons, and yes, perhaps the fire equivalent of the Night King, an embodiment of flames sent to oppose the ancient chill. But she was also Daenerys Stormborn, a woman with hopes and fears, a desire for love and a dream of a better world. Let the realm name her as they would. She would prove by her deeds that she did not stand for tyranny or slaughter, but for a chance at peace. The night air felt less bitter on her cheeks, and she took Jon's arm as they surveyed the battered but unbroken castle. Winterfell had endured the long night. She had faced and vanquished the greatest threat the living had ever known. Now, as dawn's first light crept over the horizon, Daenerys wondered if the prophecy of ice and fire, of the endless cycle of war, might finally find resolution in her hands. She had destroyed the Night King, and in doing so, had awakened something within herself that was simultaneously exhilarating and terrifying. She vowed silently as the sky turned pale with the promise of morning that she would wield her power with compassion and justice. She did not know if the realm would ever see her as simply a ruler rather than a mythic figure, but it no longer mattered. She was here, alive, and willing to shoulder the weight. The warmth of the rising sun caressed her face, banishing the lingering chill. Perhaps this was the dawn they had all been waiting for, a new day in which the fires of life stood triumphant over the night. If so, she would be ready not as a demigod or a chosen champion, but as Daenerys Targaryen, woman, queen, and bearer of the flame that would keep the darkness at bay. And in that quiet moment, as the world began to stir with renewed hope, she felt certain that though the night might come again, she would forever stand watch with fire in her eyes, a living embodiment of the dawn breaking over an endless winter. Daenerys Targaryen had always found it curious how, in the silence after the chaos, she could hear her heart beating louder than the thunder of armies. Every breath was a reminder that she had survived, but she often asked herself at what cost. The victory at Winterfell over the Night King had ignited 1,000 rumors and twice as many songs. Even now, as the north winds rattled the shutters in the great castle, she could sense that her name was whispered with both reverence and fear. She was the one who had taken on the embodiment of an endless winter and shattered his icy form with dragonglass, the first in generations to bring about the downfall of a threat so ancient that it had passed into legend long before she was born. Yet though her triumph shone like a beacon, it also cast the darkest of shadows. The days that followed the victory over the dead had been consumed with the necessary labor of mourning. The courtyard of Winterfell, once ankle-deep in snow and churned earth, had filled with pyres that belched ash and sparks into the slate-colored sky. Remnants of the undead were burned in separate heaps, for though the magic that once drove them was gone, no one wished to bury the corpses of wights lest foul sorcery linger in their bones. The living who had fallen were granted what honors could be mustered, a name, a prayer, the solemn vow that their sacrifice would be remembered. Daenerys presided over these ceremonies with subdued dignity, her arms folded beneath the heavy white fur that Sansa Stark had provided. She felt the heat of the flames on her cheeks, saw the tears that mixed with the grime on survivors' faces, and she knew that history had been made in those nights, that everything to come would bear the imprint of what had transpired within Winterfell's walls. Soldiers who had warred beside her, Northerners, Dothraki, Unsullied, Knights of the Vale, even a smattering of Riverlords looked at her differently now. She was still their queen, still the mother of dragons, but she had stepped into a mythic space. Rumors abounded that she was Azor Ahai reborn, a figure out of ancient prophecy whose presence alone might banish the long night. Some insisted she was a fire god in mortal skin, neither fully human nor fully divine, but poised between realms. Others whispered she was the perfect mirror of the Night King she'd destroyed, the living flame that rose to counter his darkness. Daenerys knew better. She had felt her own flesh bruise in that battle, felt exhaustion claw at her bones and tears freeze on her lashes. If she'd been some cosmic force, she would not have ached so deeply or bled so freely. She was only a woman, albeit one who carried a mighty and terrible power in her dragons. Yet her simplest truths did not matter to those who yearned for miracles or who saw her as a threat to the old order. History, she reminded herself, was always shaped by storytellers, bards who molded truth into legend. Perhaps that was inevitable. She had once told herself that she did not want to be a queen of ashes, but ashes and embers marked her steps wherever she went, from the day she hatched her dragons in Drogo's pyre to the moment she had driven a dagger of dragoglass into the Night King's chest. Now, in the uncertain calm after that cataclysm, she had to piece together what remained of the living world and confront the fragility of her grand dreams. She found solace with her dragons, though their number was cruelly diminished. Drogon and Regal bore fresh scars from the battle, their black and green scales slashed and pitted from the frost-lanced weapons of the White Walkers. The memory of Viserion, her fallen child, twisted into an undead monstrosity, still pricked her heart like a blade each night. She had destroyed him even as she destroyed the Night King, and that bittersweet triumph would haunt her until her final breath. Often at twilight, she walked out to the stables where Drogon curled, watchful and massive, the heat of his body melting the snow around his claws. She would run a hand over his forelimbs, speaking soft words in High Valyrian, coaxing him into a calm that belied his savage power. He would rumble softly in response, as though he understood her grief and her determination in equal measure. Sometimes Jon Snow, or Aegon Targaryen as she now knew him to be, joined her. The knowledge of his parentage weighed heavily between them. She could see it in the tightness of his jaw and the cautious glances he gave her. They had crossed a threshold that neither of them had expected. Yet the bond they'd forged in peril still endured, a quiet undercurrent that led him to stand by her side even though the question of succession loomed. Was he a potential rival or the rightful heir? The realm was in flux and so were their hearts. Daenerys knew Jon did not desire the Iron Throne, but the hearts of men were fickle, and the lords who flocked to Winterfell seeking new alliances had begun to whisper that perhaps Jon, as the secret son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, would be the better claimant, heir to the blood of both ice and fire. Daenerys struggled to keep her composure whenever she sensed such talk, for it threatened to unravel every dream she had sacrificed so much to attain. But if the living were to prosper at all, the conflict with the dead could not be replaced by yet another bitter contest for the throne. Even Sansa Stark, who eyed Daenerys with wary intelligence, seemed to grasp that unity was needed. Sansa's wariness had not vanished, but the mistrust felt tempered by the realization that Daenerys had risked her dragons, her life, for the North. In that sense, an unspoken respect glimmered between the two women. Neither would call the other a friend, but they had fought shoulder to shoulder against an inhuman foe and emerged victorious. Though snow still fell intermittently, the worst of the sorcerous winter had abated. Messengers came and went from Winterfell's courtyard daily, carrying ravens to distant castles and receiving envoys who braved the winter roads to treat with the Dragon Queen. They spoke of the shock rippling through the land. The wall was shattered in places, yet the threat behind it was destroyed. The North had survived, though battered, and the spring that might follow this winter could well reshape the entire realm. Lords of the Riverlands and the Vale, who had joined the fight late or offered supplies, arrived with their retinues to pay homage to Daenerys or at least glean some advantage from the new order. Tyrions and Tarlys, estranged from their old allegiances, came with pleas or concessions. The Crownlands themselves were in turmoil, for Cersei Lannister still sat in the Red Keep, her hold on power tenuous but not broken. and the Ironborn under Euron Greyjoy lurked in the waters to the east, a vulture waiting for the realm's final collapse. Daenerys convened council after council in the dark wood of Winterfell's great hall, lit by rows of torches and braziers. Tyrion was ever at her side, the lines on his face deeper now than they had been in Meereen, his quick wit tempered by an uncharacteristic solemnity. Lord Varys, though overshadowed by events he could scarcely manipulate, continued to gather information from his little birds. Grey Worm and the Unsullied maintained their disciplined watch. Even the Dothraki, fewer in number but still fierce, lingered in the castle's outskirts, ill at ease in the cold but bound by loyalty to their Khaleesi. They strategized daily about what to do next. Some argued that the Queen should march south at once, put King's Landing under siege, and topple Cersei's regime. Others warned that the realm was exhausted by war and might balk at another bloody campaign. The lords of the north worried about their harvests, the shortage of supplies, the wounded who still needed healing. Daenerys herself vacillated. She had come to claim the Iron Throne, but she also recognized that if she pressed too hard now, she might shatter the fragile goodwill that had formed around her after defeating the Night King. She had to tread carefully, balancing her sense of destiny against the practical needs of a war-weary people. On a brittle morning that threatened snow, Daenerys called her closest advisors to a smaller solar in Winterfell's upper floors. The wind rattled the shutters, but a fire blazed in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across the walls. She stood near the flames, warming her hands. Tyrion, Varys, Grey Worm, Missandei, and Jon Snow or Aegon, as Tyrion persisted in calling him in private, gathered in a half-circle around her. She looked at each face, seeing the trust and doubt intermingled in their expressions. Missandei, in particular, caught her eye with quiet compassion. Daenerys felt momentarily comforted. Here was someone who had believed in her since their earliest days in Essos. "We must decide upon our next course of action," Daenerys began, her voice low but clear. "The war against the dead is done, but the realm is still fractured. Ye people suffer from hunger from ravaged lands, and Cersei Lannister remains in King's Landing clinging to the throne. She has the Golden Company at her disposal as well as whatever loyalists remain of the Lannister forces. The question before us is whether we ride south soon or allow the kingdom time to heal." Tyrion pressed his fingers together in that characteristic gesture that hinted at deep thought. "Your Grace, the lords who have arrived with offers of fealty do so under the assumption that you will claim the Iron Throne. They sense that after your victory in the north you are unstoppable. Waiting too long might erode that aura of inevitability." Varys inclined his head, the firelight glinting off his bald pate. "True, but we must also consider that fear alone cannot be the foundation of rule, especially after so much bloodshed. You have the goodwill of many because you fought for the living. If you descend upon King's Landing and burn it to the ground, that goodwill will dissolve into terror." "Then we won't burn it to the ground," Daenerys said firmly, though a muscle in her jaw tightened. She could not forget what had happened in Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen, the horrors she had ended with fire and the scorn she had faced when the survivors interpreted her justice as brutality. "I want to be a different kind of ruler. But I also cannot allow Cersei to remain. She is cruel, cunning, and she will plot against me at every turn. The longer she sits the throne, the more likely she is to sow chaos behind our backs." Jon cleared his throat, drawing every gaze. "We should consider sending envoys south before assembling a massive army. Winterfell is already strained to the limit. Food is scarce. Our people are not in a condition to march for weeks on end." His voice held the quiet authority Daenerys had come to respect. "If we parley, we might discover whether Cersei still has any allies left with genuine power. If she's as isolated as we suspect, her hold on the city might collapse without a full-scale siege. The people of King's Landing might even welcome a queen who saved the realm." Daenerys eyed him, reading the tension in his brow. A part of her wanted to declare that parley with Cersei was futile, that the Lannister queen would never negotiate in good faith. But she remembered the cost of open war, burned fields, slaughtered innocents, and bitterness that would fester for years. She had promised herself to break the wheel, not become another spoke in it. "Very well," she said at last. "We will dispatch envoys to King's Landing, offering terms that ensure a peaceful transition of power. We will also send word to the Stormlands, the Reach, what remains of it, to Dorne and the Iron Islands, inviting them to join us in rebuilding the realm. If Cersei refuses, then we will have no choice but to act." But let us see if, for once, reason can prevail. Tyrion inclined his head, clearly relieved. An excellent plan, your grace. I can draft letters that strike a balance between firmness and magnanimity. Daenerys turned her attention to Grey Worm, whose face was inscrutable behind his soldier's composure. You and the Unsullied will remain at Winterfell for the time being. I need you here to maintain order while the North recovers. Keep the Dothraki patrolling the roads, preventing any brigands or deserters from raiding the smallfolk. We've lost enough people to the dead, we can't allow the living to prey upon each other. Grey Worm bowed his head. Yes, your grace. The rest of the group murmured agreement. In that moment, Daenerys felt a fleeting sense of confidence. The realm had endured the ultimate horror, perhaps now they could find a better way forward. And yet, as the meeting broke apart and her advisors drifted into separate tasks, a strange hollowness pooled in her stomach. She had confronted the Night King with steel and dragonfire, but the battles of politics required subtler weapons and the potential betrayals struck from unexpected corners. She could vanquish an army on the field, but could she rule a land rife with old loyalties and hatreds? The question pricked her mind even as she set about planning the next phase of her campaign. News trickled in from the south over the following days. Cersei had indeed summoned the Golden Company to King's Landing. Word had it that she used the threat of Daenerys's dragons to justify new levies and taxes, draining resources from the already weary capital. Some of the lords in the Crownlands seemed reluctant to provide further aid. Rumors abounded of unrest in the city, with overworked gold cloaks trying to keep order. The Iron Bank, rumored to have been repaid by Cersei, kept a watchful eye but offered no direct interference yet. Meanwhile, in the Westerlands, chaos reigned. Some minor Lannister cousins claimed seats of power, while others declared neutrality, uncertain which way the wind would blow. From Dorne came more promising tidings. The remaining Martell loyalists, along with several of the Dornish houses, were said to be amenable to an alliance, especially if it meant ridding themselves of Lannister rule. Dorne had never forgiven the atrocities committed against Elia Martell and her children, and later outrages against their own princes. If Daenerys's envoys arrived bearing news of the Night King's defeat and the promise of a just realm, Dorne might willingly bend the knee or at least join forces in a grand alliance. The Stormlands were a more uncertain matter. Gendry, the bastard of Robert Baratheon whom Jon had legitimized in the aftermath of the war, possessed a claim to the region, but he was young in lordship and untested in politics. Many of the Stormland lords had retreated behind their walls, suspicious of Targaryens, remembering Robert's rebellion and the countless old grievances. Tactful persuasion would be needed to bring them into the fold. In the midst of these shifting dynamics, winter's snows fell intermittently but seemed to lose their ferocity. Each day, the winds softened, and the nights, though cold, no longer felt steeped in the unnatural chill that had heralded the undead. Westeros appeared poised for a slow thaw. Yet for all that, Daenerys still found herself unable to shake a sense of foreboding, as if the land were holding its breath. One evening, she found herself in the Godswood again. She had come here more often than she cared to admit, drawn to the quiet hush beneath the red leaves of the weirwood, to the faint trickle of water beneath thin ice in the small pool at its base. The red eyes carved into the heart tree seemed to watch her with a somber intensity. She could not forget Bran Stark's words. The Night King had been the embodiment of an ancient darkness, and in destroying him, she had become something of an opposite force in the eyes of many, the living flame that balanced the cosmic scale. She did not want such a role. She was a mortal woman, not a deity. Yet the realm was hungry for symbols and myths, especially after so harrowing an apocalypse. She heard a light step on the snow and turned to see Arya Stark approaching. The younger woman moved with uncanny grace, as if she scarcely displaced the air around her. Though Daenerys had not spoken much with Arya, she respected the lethal competence evident in the girl's eyes. Arya had her own secrets, her own fierce independence. In the aftermath of the long night, tales circulated that Arya had played her part as well. Some said she had slain a White Walker with a single thrust, displaying cunning beyond her years. Daenerys did not doubt it. The whole Stark family had proven a formidable ally, even if there was tension beneath the surface. Arya stopped a few paces away, crossing her arms. She said nothing for a moment, just studied Daenerys with those keen gray eyes, as if attempting to unravel the queen's innermost thoughts. "You come here often," Arya remarked. "Is it for quiet, or something else?" Daenerys glanced at the carved face on the weirwood. Quiet, perhaps, and a measure of reflection. I don't pray to the old gods, but there's a stillness here that comforts me. Arya shifted, hands slipping into the fur lining of her cloak. I don't pray much either, though I used to whisper names under my breath at night. Her eyes slid away momentarily, focusing on the red leaves. I just wanted you to know I'm grateful you fought for us. The statement, though simple, held weight. Daenerys inclined her head. I fought for the living, for all of us, but I appreciate your gratitude. A moment of silence passed, the night air crisp. Then Arya leveled her gaze at Daenerys again. You plan to go south soon. The North is tired of war, but it's also tired of Lannisters on the throne. If you march, I believe the Northerners who survived will follow you. Daenerys did not miss the flicker of steel in Arya's voice. I plan to offer peace first. If Cersei refuses, we won't have a choice. I hope it won't come to bloodshed, but I won't let her hold the realm hostage either. Arya nodded slowly. Just remember, not everyone who claims loyalty means it. There are faces behind masks, people who will pretend fealty to gain advantage. The war against the dead was a matter of survival, but the war for the throne, that's where betrayal thrives. Daenerys felt a chill unrelated to the cold. She recalled the betrayals she had faced in Essos, the subtle deceits and false loyalties. Westeros was no different, only the stage was grander. I know. I'll be careful. A faint smirk tugged at Arya's lips. Good. I'd hate to learn the champion of fire was undone by a backstabber. She hesitated as though weighing another thought, then took a breath. Sometimes you remind me of my sister. Determined, proud, hungry for justice. But she's also cautious, shaped by every betrayal she's seen. I wonder if you'll learn caution too, or if you'll hold to your ideals no matter the cost. Daenerys let out a slow breath. Ideals without caution can lead to ruin. But caution without ideals leaves us hollow. I hope I can find a balance. Arya studied her another moment. Then, with a nod of acknowledgement, the young woman turned and slipped silently back into the castle's corridors. Daenerys stood alone again in the Godwood, her mind awhirl with the notion that the war to come might be filled with dangers as insidious as the Night King's legion. At least with the undead, the threat had been visible, unmistakable. Against living foes, alliances shifted like quicksand. In the following week, Tyrion and Varys dispatched envoys to King's Landing, bearing letters signed by Daenerys Targaryen. The letters proclaimed her willingness to see a peaceful transition of power, to refrain from harming the city if Cersei would renounce her claim and yield. They also extended invitations to the lords of the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Iron Islands, promising an equitable arrangement under Targaryen rule. Whether these words would be heeded remained unknown. During this time, Daenerys busied herself by taking stock of the North's needs. She spoke with stewards about the condition of the granaries, with healers about the outbreak of frostbite and illness among the refugees. She made sure that the Dothraki, who were not used to such climates, were given warmer tents and additional supplies. She had Grey Worm rotate the Unsullied on guard duty in ways that minimized the risk of exposure. More than once, she traveled by horseback to outlying villages near Winterfell, offering the presence of a queen who cared to see them survive the harsh season. These gestures were small but necessary, forging a connection between her and the Northerners. Some looked on her with suspicion, fire dancers from the south, a Targaryen whose father had burned Lord Rickard Stark. But others had lost so much that they saw in Daenerys a hope for renewal. Jon accompanied her on more than one of these excursions. Their conversations were subdued, tinged with the weight of his parentage. She could sense his struggle. Raised as Ned Stark's son, he still felt every fiber of his being loyal to the North, yet the blood of the dragon ran in his veins. Sometimes, as they rode side by side through snowdrifts that sparkled in the weak sunlight, she glimpsed the fleeting possibility of a future where they might rule together, forging unity out of the fractious realm. But before she could let that dream blossom, 1,000 complications intruded. What if the lords demanded Jon's ascension over hers? What if old Targaryen enemies used his claim to undermine her? She did not want to see him as a rival, she trusted his sincerity. But the realm had ways of turning allies into adversaries. Still, there were precious moments when they left politics aside, if only for the span of a heartbeat. Daenerys found herself laughing quietly at some wry comment he made about the northern cold, or she noticed how his guard softened when he looked at her. It was never quite enough to erase her worries, but it reminded her that they were both human, bound by something deeper than ambition. They had faced the long night together, and that created a bond no crown could break. At last, ravens returned from the south. The responses were mixed as expected. Cersei's letter was curt and laced with veiled threats, rejecting Daenerys' demands outright. She insisted she was the rightful queen of the Seven Kingdoms and that any approach on King's Landing would be met with the full might of the Golden Company. She also hinted that if Daenerys marched, she would turn the city into a battleground. The letter reeked of desperation hidden behind arrogance. From the Stormlands came a more cautious reply. A few lords expressed willingness to meet with Daenerys' representatives, perhaps to discuss terms if Gendry Baratheon was formally recognized as Lord of Storm's End. The Storm Lords were famously stubborn, but hunger and devastation from the prolonged wars had left them eager for stability. Dorne's message was more welcoming. Several Dornish lords pledged to join Daenerys if she moved against King's Landing, though they would not swear fealty until the city was actually in her hands. The Iron Islands under Yara Greyjoy responded that if Daenerys recognized their claim to independence, they would sail against Euron and aid in taking King's Landing from the sea. The possibility of a free Iron Islands, however, raised new questions about the nature of Targaryen rule. Daenerys convened a second war council in the Great Hall, this time with representatives from the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands in attendance as well, to glean their perspectives. The hall was crowded with lords, ladies, and knights, all hunched around long tables laden with maps and half-consumed cups of spiced wine. Sansa stood near Jon, their red-brown and dark hair a stark contrast to Daenerys' silver-gold. Bran was not present, as he seldom seemed inclined to attend such councils now, lost in mysteries of his own. Arya lingered at the back, arms crossed. Tyrion stood by Daenerys' side, half-sitting on a corner of the table with a cup of wine in his hand, the flicker of torchlight catching the lines of worry on his face. Daenerys looked around the assembly. She recognized the mixture of awe and trepidation on their faces. So many houses, so many agendas. But they all looked to her for leadership, at least for now. Cersei has refused diplomacy, Daenerys began, her voice echoing off the stone walls. She intends to hold King's Landing against us by force, with the Golden Company as her shield. We know the city's fortifications are formidable and the cost in lives if we lay siege might be immense. A mutter ran through the crowd. One older knight, wearing the sigil of House Manderly, a merman, stepped forward, clearing his throat. We cannot leave the Lannister Queen in power, Your Grace. She threatened the entire realm by refusing to send aid against the Night King. Now that we have survived, we cannot allow her to cause further bloodshed. But how do we take the city without destroying it? Tyrion exchanged a glance with Daenerys. In my time at King's Landing, I learned that the city's people can be swayed. They want safety and food. If we can blockade the city by land and sea, cut off the supply lines, we might force Cersei's hand without an all-out assault. Missandei, standing beside Grey Worm, lifted her chin. Blockades can last for months. The realm is weary. Are we prepared for a siege that might drag on, especially in winter? Jon folded his arms, brow knitted. We have to consider our own supply lines, too. The North cannot feed a massive army for an extended siege. We'd need support from the southern regions. The Reach was once the breadbasket of Westeros, but after the wars it's uncertain how much food remains. The Stormlands are hardly better off. A messenger from the Vale, a lean man in a dark blue cloak, spoke up. The Vale still has some reserves, but it will take time to transport supplies to a southern siege camp. And time is something we may not have in abundance. Daenerys listened to the torrent of concerns, her thoughts swirling. She envisioned the city she had never seen, King's Landing, thronged with thousands upon thousands of common folk. The memory of how she had liberated cities in Essos came to mind, Astapor, Yunkai, Meereen. She had used her dragons to strike fear into the hearts of the oppressors and break open the gates. But those cities had been smaller and the causes more straightforward: slavery, cruelty, a clear moral line. King's Landing was not so simple. It teemed with innocent families who had no say in Cersei's tyranny. She did not want to reduce them to ash to gain a throne. If we do not attack, Cersei grows stronger by the day, insisted Lord Royce of the Vale. The Golden Company may wait us out, gather supplies, entrench themselves in the city. Or Euron Greyjoy may bring in supplies by sea. Daenerys pressed her lips together. Euron was a wild card, a vicious opportunist who had once boasted that he could defeat any foe on the open waters. If he committed fully to defending King's Landing, the city might hold out much longer. On the other hand, Yara Greyjoy had offered to challenge him at sea if Daenerys recognized Ironborn autonomy. Tyrion exhaled. A blockade is possible, but we'd need the Iron Fleet, or at least Yara's portion of it, to neutralize Euron. Then we'd need forces on land to encircle the city. If done properly, it might minimize casualties. The question is whether we can rely on Yara's loyalty if we promise her independence. Daenerys straightened her shoulders, thinking of how many compromises she had made in Essos to achieve stability. If granting the Iron Islands their autonomy spares tens of thousands of lives in King's Landing, I will consider it, she said quietly but firmly. I made deals in Slavers Bay to end bloodshed. I will not cling to absolute power if it leads to needless death. My priority is the realm's well-being, not my own pride. Her words caused a stir among the gathered lords. Some bristled at the notion of letting the Iron Islands secede. What precedent would that set? Others recognized the practicality behind her statement. Sansa Stark, from her vantage point beside Jon, inclined her head as though grudgingly impressed by Daenerys's willingness to concede territory for the sake of peace. The discussion raged for hours, culminating in a plan to gather their combined forces slowly without draining the north entirely and then move southward in stages, forging alliances with the Reach and Dorne. The blockade strategy would be put into action if negotiations remained fruitless. Meanwhile, they would send further sea correspondence to Yara offering independence in exchange for her support against Euron. If all went as planned, King's Landing would be surrounded by land and sea with minimal bloodshed. Perhaps the city would rise up against Cersei once they realized liberation was at hand. Perhaps. Amid the swirl of planning and debate, Daenerys felt an undercurrent of tension. The lords of Westeros were not blind to the fact that Jon might also claim the throne. Yet Jon showed no sign of grasping for power. He stood at Daenerys' side, offering his counsel but never once undercutting her authority. Some saw that as proof of his loyalty, others saw it as him biding his time. The realm's rumor mill churned, but the two of them went about their duties in unison, ignoring the whispers. Over the next month, the slow mobilization began. The snows eased further, roads becoming marginally passable. Small columns of northern soldiers, bolstered by Vale Knights and a fraction of Daenerys' own forces, began to move south. Daenerys planned to accompany them once the path was clear, though she intended to leave enough troops behind to safeguard Winterfell. The last thing she wanted was for another threat to arise in the north if opportunists realized most of her men were gone. Amid these preparations, a raven arrived from Dorne. The tone was urgent. Prince Corran of House Martell, distant kin to the late Elia, invited Daenerys to meet in person at Sunspear, promising to pledge Dornish support if she could show them her sincerity. Tyrion and Varys both thought it wise to at least consider the invitation. Securing Dorne's cooperation might prove decisive, given Dorne's ability to harass any royalist forces from the south and also feed the blockade if necessary. Torn between the strategic importance of visiting Dorne and the need to oversee the main body of her forces, Daenerys hesitated. Yet it occurred to her that a personal meeting might carry more weight than any letter. She recalled how in Meereen she had learned the value of personal presence, appearing before the freedmen and negotiating face-to-face with Yunkai's emissaries. If she convinced the Dornish nobility of her intentions, they might unify behind her faster than letters ever could accomplish. Thus, it was decided that Daenerys would lead a relatively small party to Sunspear. She would take Drogon, of course, and a handful of Unsullied for personal protection. Grey Worm insisted on commanding them himself, citing the need to ensure the Queen's safety. Missandei would accompany Daenerys as well. Jon, to everyone's mild surprise, volunteered to stay behind to help coordinate the movement of troops with Sansa. It was a practical choice, someone needed to oversee the northern efforts. Yet Daenerys sensed another factor. Jon might be giving her space to negotiate alliances without complicating matters with his Targaryen claim. She appreciated the gesture, though a pang of loneliness touched her heart at the idea of leaving him behind, even briefly. The day Daenerys set out from Winterfell was cold but clear, the sky a bright winter blue. Drogon crouched in the courtyard, stirring up gusts of loose snow with his powerful wings. Armored Unsullied stood nearby, including Grey Worm at their head, ready to mount horses and ride south. Missandei was already cloaked in thick furs, her hair pulled back against the chill. Daenerys wore her own white fur-lined coat, the one she had donned before the battle with the Night King. Its edges still bore faint scorch marks, a reminder of her trials. Jon was there to see them off. He approached Daenerys, his breath a white cloud in the cold air. "Safe travels," he said, voice low, though the courtyard was noisy with preparations. "Give the Dornish reason to stand with us. Show them who you really are." She nodded, a half-smile on her lips. "And you look after our forces. Keep them from starving. Keep them organized. We'll need them strong if we're to make a stand at King's Landing." For a moment they simply looked at each other, a quiet understanding passing between them. So many words were left unsaid about lineage, about love, about the future. Then Jon leaned in, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. She let her eyes close briefly, savoring the warmth of it. When he pulled back, she offered him one last lingering smile and turned to Mount Drogon. The beast lowered his head, allowing her to climb up. As soon as she settled in the saddle, Drogon rumbled, a mixture of impatience and affection stretching his long neck skyward. The watchers in the courtyard, from minor lords to stable boys, gazed up at the towering black dragon with expressions of awe. Daenerys gripped the reins and gave a short, sharp command in Valyrian. Drogon flapped his wings, stirring a mini blizzard of snow and loose hay. Then, with a mighty lunge, he soared into the crisp northern air. Below, Grey Worm and his contingent of Unsullied set out through Winterfell's gates on horseback, with Missandei traveling in a small carriage at their center. They would not be able to keep pace with the dragon in flight, but Daenerys planned to scout ahead, then rejoin them on the march when necessary. The flight itself was exhilarating and bitterly cold. She felt the wind slicing across her cheeks, saw the patchwork of white fields and dark forests below. She recalled the first time she had climbed on Drogon's back in Meereen, how her heart had thundered at the sheer freedom. Now, that sense of freedom was tempered by responsibility, but it still sang within her, a reminder that she was more than just a queen bound to a throne. The trek south took time, even with Daenerys' ability to scout from the sky. Roads had to be cleared, fords tested, and nights were spent in half-ruined castles or hastily erected camps. Yet as they moved ever downward, the snow grew thinner, the air milder. By the time they reached the hills that marked the approach to the Red Mountains of Dorne, the climate had shifted noticeably. Patches of green broke through the frosty soil and the sun felt warmer on Daenerys' face when she dismounted to rest. It was strange to see the land in transition from winter to a subdued version of early spring. Villages along the way often had little to spare, but some local folk ventured out to greet the procession, curiosity warring with caution. They had heard of the Dragon Queen who defeated the Night King, but they also remembered the Targaryen name from songs of old conquest. Daenerys did her best to appear approachable, ensuring her soldiers did not harass the villagers, offering small tokens of coin for food and lodging. Word spread that she was not the monstrous conqueror some might have feared and that her men were disciplined, not prone to looting or cruelty. At last, they crossed into the borders of Dorne. The terrain shifted to rocky crags and dusty hills, with occasional oases of hardy desert shrubs. Even in Winter's Tale, the Dornish sun felt strong, warming Daenerys more than she had been for weeks. The Unsullied welcomed the change from the biting cold of the north. Missandei's cheeks glowed in the sunlight, and she seemed relieved as well, having grown tired of numb fingers and toes in Winterfell. A party of Dornish outriders met them on a winding pass near the river Green Blood. They wore loose-fitting garments of burnt orange and crimson, carrying spears and shortbows. At their head was a young captain with olive skin and a black mustache. He greeted Daenerys courteously, calling her Your Grace and introducing himself as Captain Quays of House Martell's Guard. He explained that Prince Corran awaited her at Sunspear, eager to host her in the Tower of the Sun. Daenerys took in the rugged beauty of the Dornish landscape as they rode the last leg of the journey. Drogon soared overhead, his massive silhouette flickering across the ground. The Dornish watchmen, though wary, could not help but stare in awe at the living embodiment of Targaryen might. More than one, Daenerys noted, glanced at her with a mixture of respect and fear. She recognized that fear intimately. She had wielded it before, in Astapor, to subdue the good masters. But she hoped here, fear could give way to cooperation. They had a realm to unite, not a city to devastate. They reached Sunspear at midday. The castle sprawled along the coast, a cluster of slender towers rising from tawny walls. The air carried a salty tang, and in the distance, Daenerys saw the sparkle of the sea. Flags bearing the Sunanspear sigil of House Martell hung from ramparts. As her party approached, trumpets sounded, and a gate swung open to admit them. Daenerys dismounted, letting Grey Worm and the Unsullied form a protective circle around her, while Missandei fell in at her side. Curious onlookers, dressed in flowing Dornish silks, peered from balconies and parapets. The warmth of the sun on Daenerys' face felt like a blessing after the bleak cold of the north. She was met in the courtyard by a tall man with sun-kissed skin and dark hair worn in tight curls. He wore a gold circlet that signified his princely status, and his garments were richly embroidered with serpentine patterns. Beside him stood a woman in a flowing gown of deep orange, her black hair braided and interwoven with gold wire. The man bowed with practiced elegance. "Welcome to Sunspear, Daenerys of House Targaryen," he said in a resonant voice. I am Prince Corin Martell, son of Prince Oberyn's distant cousin and heir to our line. We are honored to host the Mother of Dragons. Daenerys inclined her head. Thank you for your hospitality, Prince Corin. I have traveled far in hopes of forging a bond with Dorne that will benefit us both. Corin smiled, though his eyes were sharp with curiosity. We have heard many tales of your valor against the Night King. It seems the Seven Kingdoms owe you a debt. His gaze flicked upward to where Drogon circled in lazy arcs. And that is your mighty companion, I presume. Rest assured, we have prepared a suitable enclosure for him beyond the city walls unless, of course, you prefer him perched upon our towers. A faint smile tugged Daenerys's lips. He'll be fine in the enclosure as long as he has enough space to spread his wings. Drogon does not take well to confinement. Corin gestured gracefully. We shall ensure he has free range outside the city with no cause for alarm. My men will keep their distance. Then he turned to the woman beside him. Allow me to present my sister, Princess Arianne Martell. She is eager to meet you. Arianne inclined her head, eyes gleaming with intelligence. Welcome, your grace. Our father would have rejoiced to see a Targaryen return to these shores, particularly one who stands against the Lannisters. We have our reasons for disliking that family. Daenerys knew well the storied feuds between House Martell and House Lannister. She responded with polite sympathy, hoping to reassure them of her sincerity. Soon enough, they led her into the castle proper, escorting her up a spiral of sun-warmed stone steps to the Tower of the Sun. Through latticed windows, she caught glimpses of the sea stretching out in endless blue. The interior was lavish but not ostentatious, with colorful tiles depicting suns, spears, and swirling vines. Servants offered cool water infused with citrus and mint. The fragrance of spices and grilled peppers drifted from unseen kitchens. They settled in a spacious solar with plush cushions arranged around a low table. Grey Worm and two Unsullied remained standing at a respectful distance, Missandei at Daenerys' side. Corin and Arianne took seats opposite Daenerys, relaxed but attentive. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, the topic turned to matters of state. We received your letters about your intent to take the Iron Throne, Corin said. We also heard rumors of your willingness to treat with Dorne as an equal, to grant us a voice in the shaping of the new realm. Is that true? Daenerys nodded. Very much so. I did not come here to impose. I came to ask for your alliance in reclaiming King's Landing from Cersei Lannister. In return, I promise that Dorne will be respected and its autonomy in local matters assured. I know House Martell has long desired justice for the harm done to Princess Elia and your family. A flicker of pain crossed Corin's face at the mention of Elia Martell, but he suppressed it quickly. Arianne spoke instead, her voice edged with quiet passion. We have not forgotten what happened to our kin at the hands of the Lannisters, nor what happened to our Uncle Oberyn. We bided our time, seeking an opportunity to strike. But the realm fell into chaos, the war for the throne pivoting between would-be kings and queens. Then the Night King came, and we could only watch, unsure whether all life might end in an endless winter. Now we hear that you destroyed him. Daenerys inclined her head, recalling that fateful confrontation. He is gone. The dead are gone. Whatever disputes remain are between the living alone. I cannot claim to know your pain, but I can promise retribution against Cersei if she refuses to yield. I will not become a tyrant, my methods aim to prevent unnecessary slaughter. But I cannot allow her to remain on the throne. Corin tapped his fingers on the low table. Understood. Dorne is prepared to commit forces, but we require certain assurances. First, we want a formal recognition that the traditions and governance of Dorne will be respected under your rule. We have always been somewhat independent, and we wish to preserve that. Second, we want a voice in your small council if you take the throne. We have resources, wealth, and strategic positioning. We do not wish to be sidelined. Daenerys glanced at Missandei, who offered a small nod, affirming the sense in these demands. Then Daenerys replied, I can grant you a seat on the council. It will be important that every region of Westeros is represented. As for Dorne's traditional privileges, I see no reason to undermine them. My goal is to break the cycle of bloodshed and domination, not enforce uniform subjugation. Arianne's lips curled into a slight smile. Spoken like someone who's seen the horrors of tyranny. Dorne could flourish under such conditions, free from Lannister meddling. But you must know that the weight of a Targaryen name can cut both ways. Some in Dorne still recall the Targaryen conquest centuries past with bitterness. You will have to prove your rule is not like that of your ancestors. Daenerys smiled ruefully. I have spent my life proving that I am not my father, nor my forebears. I freed slaves in Essos and protected the North against the dead. If I must continue proving myself, so be it. They spoke well into the afternoon, discussing the logistics of troop movements, supply lines through the Prince's Pass and the Boneway, and how Dorne's cavalry might assist in a blockade of King's Landing from the south. Daenerys found Qhorin to be sharp but fair-minded, while Arianne was bolder in her suggestions, offering potential infiltration schemes and covert sabotage of Lannister supply lines. The synergy promised to be effective if they could coordinate with the other allies also converging on the capital. At last, as sunlight slanted through the ornate windows, they concluded their talks on a positive note. Qhorin pledged a sizable force of spearmen and light cavalry to aid Daenerys, promising to march north once they had prepared adequately. In return, Daenerys agreed to Dorne's demands of partial autonomy and a place on her future council, stating that a formal treaty would be drafted once the crown was secured. They sealed the arrangement not with a flourish of ceremonial swords, but with the clinking of glasses filled with spiced wine, a Dornish custom that left Daenerys's mouth tingling with fire. That evening, a feast was prepared in her honor. Musicians played lutes and drums, while dancers in bright silks whirled around low braziers. The courtyard of Sunspear was alive with laughter and color, the very air perfumed by grilling meats and exotic spices. Daenerys sat at a table of honor with the Martells, with Grey Worm and Missandei beside her. She tasted roasted peppers stuffed with fragrant rice, drank sweet wine that left a pleasant burn at the back of her throat, and occasionally found her eyes wandering to the swirling night sky above. It all felt surreal after so many cold nights in the north, fighting the literal embodiment of death. Now she was in a realm of warmth and intrigue, forging alliances for the living. Partway through the feast, Arianne leaned closer to Daenerys, speaking above the music. "My prince brother is pragmatic, but there's more to consider than just the pledge of our spears. Some of our bannermen are eager to join your cause, but a few still harbor resentments about Targaryen rule. You might need to show your strength as much as your kindness to ensure no one underestimates you." Daenerys sipped her wine. "I understand. I have faced doubters everywhere I've gone. Yet those who stand with me usually find they have reason to remain loyal. I don't fear a challenge." Arianne studied her intently, her dark eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "I believe you. Perhaps you are indeed the opposite force of that darkness we all feared. But be warned, the living can be more cunning than the dead, and not all who smile are friends. Even here, in Dorne, we have our share of secrets." Daenerys nodded solemnly, recalling Arya's words. "Thank you for the advice, princess. I'll remember it." That night, Daenerys retired to a lavish chamber in the Tower of the Sun, windows open to the warm sea breeze. She found herself restless, pacing over mosaics that depicted coiling vipers and blazing suns. The alliance with Dorne was a triumph, but her mind churned with the knowledge that Cersei would not yield easily. The Golden Company, Euron's fleet, the precarious allegiances of the Stormlands. It was all a tapestry of uncertainty. And overshadowing everything was the question of how the lords of Westeros would respond once the dust settled, who would accept her as queen, and who would champion Jon's hidden claim. She went to the window and looked out at the moonlit waves. Drogon had been guided to a rocky plateau outside the city where he could roost without disturbing the inhabitants. She felt him in her mind, a faint bond forged over years of mutual trust. He was content enough with the warmer air, though he missed the wide hunting grounds of the north. Daenerys breathed, letting the sea air fill her lungs, reminding herself that this was but another step in a journey she had begun so many years ago, from a timid girl sold in marriage to a warlord, to a queen who had broken chains and confronted the walking dead. She slept fitfully, dreaming of the night sky split by a line of ice and fire, two cosmic forces colliding in an endless swirl. When morning came, she awoke determined to finalize the alliance with Dorne and then return to the broader campaign. Prince Qhorin arranged for a formal ceremony in the courtyard, presenting Daenerys to the gathered Dornish lords who had traveled to Sunspear for the event. Banners in shades of red and gold snapped in the desert wind. A platform was erected for the queen to stand upon, flanked by the Martells. Daenerys was introduced as the Breaker of Chains, the Mother of Dragons, the Destroyer of the Night King. The titles rolled off Qhorin's tongue with practiced ceremony, and she could sense the hush that fell over the courtiers, some in awe, some in skepticism, others moved by a thirst for revenge against the Lannisters. She spoke briefly, reminding them that the horrors of war with the dead had proof, and that the living must unite. She pledged to respect Dornish traditions and protect their sovereignty, as long as they stood together against any threat to the realm's peace. She ended with a quiet promise. "I have seen the long night. I have felt its chill. I will not plunge our world into another nightmare of endless bloodshed. Stand with me, and I shall stand by you." She heard murmurs in the crowd. A few nodded, others bowed. It was not a thunderous ovation, but it was acceptance. In time, perhaps, she would earn their full loyalty. For now, forging an alliance of mutual benefit was enough. Corin then declared his official support, stating that Dorne would raise spears and riders to aid in taking King's Landing. The courtyard filled with applause as drums beat a rhythmic cadence. The moment felt significant, a real step toward consolidating power against Cersei. After the ceremony, Daenerys spoke more intimately with a group of Dornish lords, acknowledging their concerns about the future. Some of them worried that once King's Landing fell, the North would overshadow the rest of the kingdom under Jon Snow, whose parentage rumors had reached even these southern deserts. Daenerys assured them that the North was recovering from devastation and had no intention of subjugating anyone. She tried to dispel the notion that she and Jon were at odds. She used diplomatic language, but the doubts lingered in the back of her mind. What if everything unraveled once they toppled Cersei? By late afternoon, she was ready to depart, accompanied by Grey Worm, Missandei, and the contingent of Unsullied. Corin and Aerion saw her off at the gates of Sunspear. They parted with warm words, promising to march their forces in a few weeks' time once provisions were secured. Daenerys thanked them again and took flight on Drogon, relishing the rush of air and the glow of the descending sun across the dusty hills. Rather than returning directly to the main encampments, Daenerys decided to fly along the coast to assess the terrain, leaving the Unsullied to catch up. She soared over the shimmering sea, Drogon's wings casting a ripple of shadow on the waves. The coastline curved in a series of rocky cliffs and hidden coves, a place where the Martell Navy could potentially intercept any ships loyal to Cersei. She felt a surge of cautious optimism. Maybe, just maybe, a swift victory could be secured without leveling the city in dragonflame. But as the sun dipped lower, gilding the sky in oranges and pinks, she spotted something troubling on the horizon. Sails, black against the vibrant backdrop, moving information. She urged Drogon closer, adrenaline pulsing in her veins. A small fleet, perhaps half a dozen warships, cut through the waves. The banners were difficult to make out at first, but a gust of wind revealed a sigil like a golden kraken on black. Euron Greyjoy's ships. Daenerys hovered at a distance, not daring to draw too close. Drogon might be powerful, but a concentrated barrage of scorpion bolts or ballistae could still harm him. And if these ships were just a scouting party, there could be more. The sight of them prowling the Dornish coast so soon after her successful negotiation alarmed her. Could Euron be trying to strike a deal with Prince Corin? Or was he here to disrupt any alliance, perhaps forging a different pact with rest of Dornish lords? Or simply harassing shipping lanes? She watched as the ships continued southward, hugging the coast as if searching for something. Her heart thumped. If they stumbled upon the Dornish harbors unprepared, or if they landed to sow chaos, it could ruin the nascent alliance. She had to warn Corin, but she also had to be wary. Flying too close might provoke Euron. With a heavy exhale, she guided Drogon back inland, figuring she would find a safe place to land and dispatch a messenger. She regretted not having any war galleys of her own nearby. Yara Greyjoy was the one with naval power on her side. But Yara's fleets were scattered, and negotiations with her were still ongoing. Landing on a sandy stretch near the mouth of the Brimstone River, Daenerys quickly penned a note for Prince Corin, instructing him to fortify the coasts. She gave it to one of her unsullied messengers, who rode at breakneck speed back to Sunspear. Then she rejoined Grey Worm and Missandei, explaining what she had seen. Grey Worm's mouth tightened grimly. They sail under the Golden Kraken, which means Euron is likely in command, Daenerys said. We must assume he's come to disrupt any alliance we try to form. He might attempt to lure discontented Dornish lords or threaten them. We can't let him do that. Grey Worm's voice was measured. Should we attack now, Your Grace? Drogon can destroy a few ships if we catch them unprepared. Daenerys stared out at the dusky sky, considering. If we attack directly, Euron may have traps. He's cunning. And if we lose Drogon, everything is undone. No, let's not act hastily. For now, we keep watch. If Euron makes a move against Sunspear, the Martells will be ready. In the meantime, we gather intelligence and continue to meet with our other allies. The more we corner Euron and Cersei, the fewer options they'll have. They made camp inland that night, setting a watch for safety. Daenerys paced in her tent, mind buzzing with possibilities. Euron's presence so far south was an ominous sign. It suggested Cersei was not idle. She was actively probing for weak points, forging alliances of her own, or seeking to sabotage Daenerys's. The Queen of the Seven Kingdoms might claim to spurn negotiations, but she was too clever to merely wait behind the walls of King's Landing. The confrontation was brewing on multiple fronts. Daenerys slept in fitful bursts, dream flickers of Euron's ships clashing with Dornish spears, of King's Landing in flames, of Cersei's mocking laughter. She awoke with a start in the gray pre-dawn, heart pounding, her mouth dry. Stepping outside her tent, she found the air unexpectedly warm under a star-strewn sky. Drogon was curled a short distance away, half asleep, his flanks rising and falling in a steady rhythm. A faint breeze carried the scent of parched earth and distant salt. She closed her eyes, calming her breathing. She reminded herself of everything she had overcome, the Dothraki Sea, the slavers of Essos, the politics of Meereen, and the living embodiment of the long night. She was not one to be frightened off by a handful of war galleys on the horizon. This was merely the next challenge, another path she had to navigate on the road to the Iron Throne. When the sun rose, they continued northward, occasionally circling back to keep an eye on the coast. The black-sailed ships never drew closer inland, apparently content to sail further south out of sight. Daenerys wondered if Euron might attempt to land on some secluded beach to parley with rebellious elements, or if he was merely scouting. She resolved to send word of the sighting not just to Sunspear, but to the north as well. Perhaps Yara could be spurred into action more quickly. As they made their slow journey back toward the Stormlands region, Daenerys's company received a steady stream of messages from various corners of the realm. Some carried good news. The Vale Lords were sending more knights to join the blockade force. The Riverlands were mostly secured under House Tully, though they remained cautious about committing large numbers of men. Other tidings were troubling. The Crownlands were cracking down under Lannister rule with new taxes and forced levies. Cersei had apparently stationed scorpions on the walls of King's Landing, braced for dragon attacks. Meanwhile, the Stormlands were in disarray, uncertain whether to rally behind Gendry Baratheon or remain neutral until a victor emerged. The picture that emerged was one of a realm on the brink of yet another civil war, albeit one overshadowed by the relief that the undead were no longer a threat. To Daenerys, it felt both promising and precarious. She had powerful allies, the North, the Vale, the Martells, and presumably House Tyrell's remnants, though leadership in the Reach was scattered after the fall of Highgarden. She had her dragons, well, 2 dragons, though Rhaegal was back in the north recovering, and her Unsullied, and the Dothraki. But the realm was so exhausted by conflict that if she misstepped, she might alienate the very people she needed. She told herself that measured force was best, that negotiation was the path forward, but the fear that Cersei might corner her into a brutal battle gnawed at her. Day by day, she pressed on, sometimes landing in small towns to gather fresh supplies, sometimes flying ahead to scout. Word of her presence spread through the countryside, and at times she was met by small folk who cheered her, presenting meager offerings of fruit or bread. Always she thanked them graciously, mindful that generosity in these harsh times was a true sacrifice. She told herself she would not betray that goodwill with wanton violence. At last, they passed into the fringes of the Stormlands, where the terrain shifted once more to rolling hills and windswept moors. The air grew cooler, though not as cold as the north. Storm's End, the ancient Baratheon stronghold, loomed on a rocky promontory overlooking the sea. Daenerys considered visiting Gendry there to secure the Stormlands' support, but a messenger intercepted them with news that Gendry was actually on his way north to meet with Jon Snow, seeking to coordinate with northern forces. Since time was short, Daenerys decided not to divert. Instead, she pressed on for the Crownlands, intending to rendezvous with the main body of her troops in a camp near Hayford. They arrived at the encampment a week later. It sprawled over a series of gentle hills just outside the range of King's Landing's watchtowers, close enough to threaten the city if necessary, yet far enough to avoid immediate confrontation. The banners of numerous houses fluttered in the breeze: Mormont, Royce, Manderley, Reed, and many more. The Dothraki had pitched their tents in a separate cluster, the Unsullied forming orderly rows of canvas shelters. Daenerys noted how the camp had expanded since she left Winterfell. More soldiers were arriving each day, though many looked underfed and worn from the rigors of travel and prior battles. She swept over them on Drogon's back, noticing the commotion her arrival caused. Men craned their necks, squinting at the black dragon overhead. Some cheered, others bowed their heads. Daenerys guided Drogon to land on an open patch where Tyrion and Varys waited. She dismounted, letting Grey Worm and Missandei catch up as they arrived on horseback. Tyrion approached, brushing dust off his doublet, his face etched with relief. "Your Grace," he said with a brisk nod. "We weren't expecting you quite so soon. How fares Dorne?" Daenerys greeted him warmly, summarizing the alliance with Prince Corran and the potential threat posed by Euron's ships. Varys listened intently, his expression pensive, occasionally tapping his fingertips together. They led her to a makeshift command tent, large and breezy, where maps were pinned to wooden boards. Inside, Jon Snow was waiting, along with Sansa, both looking travel-stained and tired from their own journeys. Seeing Jon caused a flutter in Daenerys's chest she hadn't expected. She realized how much she had missed him even during the short separation. He gave her a faint smile, though he was clearly weighed down by responsibility. "We're gathering more men each day," Jon explained once they had settled around the table. "But morale is shaky. Many are afraid of another bloody siege, and the Storm landlords remain divided about Gendry's claim. We've had some success forging alliances, but it's a patchwork. Cersei, on the other hand, has consolidated her forces inside the city, and her supply ships come in from time to time, likely from Euron's direction. We suspect he's ensuring she doesn't starve." Sansa pressed her lips together. "Scouts say the Golden Company is fortifying the walls, mounting scorpions on towers. If we attack by dragonfire, we risk those bolts finding their mark." Daenerys frowned, recalling Viserion's death at the hands of the Night King's ice spear. Dragons were powerful, but not invincible. She turned to Tyrion. "So, a direct assault is out of the question. That leaves us with the blockade plan. Has it moved forward?" Tyrion nodded, though he looked troubled. "We're stationing men along the Rosby Road and the King's Road. But the city can still be supplied by sea. We need Yara's ships to counter Euron's. Last we heard, she's mustering her fleets, but it might take weeks for her to arrive. Meanwhile, the people in King's Landing are suffering under higher taxes and forced conscription. If we starve the city, that burden falls on the innocent." Daenerys' stomach twisted. She had not wanted a war of attrition that punished the small folk. Cersei's cruelty would only be magnified if the city was besieged by land with no relief from the outside. The moral quandary was acute: blockade the city to depose Cersei but risk starving thousands who had no say in her rule. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the tent hush around her. When she opened them, she spoke quietly. "We cannot starve them indefinitely. Is there any way to negotiate a surrender from within? Some among Cersei's court might be willing to turn on her if they see a better alternative. Or perhaps the people themselves." Jon glanced at her, sympathy in his eyes. "The people might rise up if they're pushed too far. But Cersei rules by fear. Her men will crush any uprising swiftly." Sansa's expression was cold. "The smallfolk rarely rebel. They're too busy surviving. Cersei's men will kill them in the streets if they try." Daenerys' mind flicked back to Meereen, to the sons of the Harpy who had murdered in the shadows. She had eventually won that battle by uniting the freedmen and second sons, but it was not a swift or bloodless victory. King's Landing was far larger, the stakes higher. Tyrion set his wine cup on the table with a soft thud. "We have some potential back channels inside the city, sympathetic merchants, perhaps a few discontented minor lords. But so far, none have risked outright treason. They remember what happened to those who displeased Cersei in the past." A hush fell over the tent as they weighed their options. Daenerys scanned the map on the table. King's Landing ringed by walls, the Blackwater Bay to the south and east, the Rosby Road to the north, the Gold Road to the west. She imagined the scorpions perched on the walls, the uneasy populace, and Cersei smirking from the Red Keep. The memory of the Night King's piercing gaze flashed through her mind, along with the electric moment she had driven the Dragoglass dagger home. That had been a confrontation of cosmic magnitude, yet in some ways this felt more daunting. The living were far more complex than the dead. "Yara's support at sea is critical," Daenerys said at last. "We must accelerate negotiations with her. If we can cut off Euron, we can prevent the city from receiving supplies. Then we offer terms again. We do everything in our power to avoid a massacre." And if Cersei still refuses, she hesitated, hearing the echo of roars and screams in her memory. "If she still refuses, we might have to show strength, but we do so carefully, targeting her defenses rather than the people." Sansa regarded her with guarded eyes. "You mean to burn the scorpions and walls? A partial assault?" Daenerys nodded. "We can't let them pick Drogon out of the sky or pin Regal to the ground. We could strike at night, perhaps with precision. But that's a last resort only if all else fails. Jon gently placed a hand over hers, a brief gesture of solidarity. We will find a way. One step at a time, as we did in Winterfell. She managed a small, grateful smile before drawing her hand away. Yes. One step at a time. They spent the remainder of the evening finalizing details for the blockade, dispatching more scouts along the coast in the hope of catching Euron's ships if they ventured too close. Envoys were sent once more to Yara, urging haste and reiterating Daenerys' willingness to grant the Iron Islands independence if it meant saving thousands of lives. Tyrion wrote another letter appealing to merchants inside King's Landing, subtly offering leniency if they helped undermine Cersei's grip. Varys looked pensive, quietly noting that the spider's webs needed time to work. Late that night, Daenerys left the command tent and wandered among the rows of campfires. Soldiers dozed in bedrolls or told bawdy jokes, passing around skinfuls of sour wine. A few recognized her and quickly rose, bowing or saluting, uncertain how to address the legendary Targaryen who had slain the Night King. She offered them gentle smiles, urging them to rest well. Then she found herself standing at a vantage point from which she could see the distant glow of King's Landing on the horizon. Even from here, the city's lights glittered like a cluster of fallen stars. So many souls lived behind those walls, unwitting pawns in a game of queens and lords. She sighed. The tent flaps behind her rustled and she turned to see Jon approaching. He had changed into simpler attire, his posture weary. Without speaking, he stood beside her, both of them gazing at the faint lights in the distance. I sometimes think, she said softly, that we might have been better off never knowing how to claim crowns or wage wars. Jon's breath was a soft cloud in the cool night air. I've thought the same. But we can't unlearn what we know. A quiet pause. The world needs strong leadership now. Otherwise we descend into chaos. You've seen the cost of that in Essos. She gave a faint nod. Chaos let the slave masters flourish. It let the dead march south. And it allowed monsters like Euron to terrorize the seas. We have to fight for something better. Jon exhaled, shifting his gaze to her. His voice was tinged with sincerity. I know you'll do everything to avoid another slaughter. I trust that. The others do too, even if they doubt or fear. We all saw what you did in Winterfell, risking everything for strangers. Don't let the cynicism here make you forget your own heart. She looked at him, and in that moment, the swirl of politics faded, leaving only two people who had survived the unthinkable together. She reached out, gently touching his hand. Thank you. Sometimes I need reminding. He squeezed her hand in return. Under the silent stars, for a moment they let themselves believe in a world where duty did not overshadow every breath. But the glow of King's Landing in the distance was a constant reminder of the trials yet to come. They were on the brink of shaping history once more, whether it would be a new dawn or a descent into further darkness remained uncertain. In the days that followed, Daenerys maintained a hectic schedule, meeting with lords arriving from across the realm, inspecting the steadily growing blockade lines, and dispatching more ravens to Dorne and the Vale. Reports trickled in from Yara Greyjoy. Her ships were gathering near Pike, preparing to sail around the continent to meet Daenerys' forces. If they could orchestrate a pincer with the Dornish navy, Euron might be cornered. Still, the timing was uncertain and Cersei's capacity for cruelty was limitless. Every dawn, Daenerys rose and surveyed King's Landing from the sky on Drogon's back, measuring the city's defenses, noting the movements of supply wagons. She never ventured too close, mindful of the scorpions bristling along the walls. Occasionally, she glimpsed a flash of gold armor or the reflection of sunlight on steel, a reminder that the Golden Company was vigilant. And each day she wrestled with the knowledge that tens of thousands of innocents lay beyond those walls, trapped in a web of Cersei's making. Then, abruptly, an opportunity presented itself, one that could shift the entire course of the siege. Late one afternoon, Varys arrived at Daenerys' tent, his expression more animated than she had seen in weeks. He bowed slightly, the candlelight dancing on his smooth scalp. "My queen," he said quietly, "I have received a message through one of my little birds. Cersei is planning a grand ceremony in the Great September Ruins, what remains of it, hoping to display the Golden Company's strength and quell unrest. Her intention is to parade their elephants." "Elephants?" Daenerys asked, startled. Yes, apparently the Golden Company did indeed bring a few war elephants. Not many, but enough to create a spectacle. Cersei means to show the people that she holds unstoppable might, attempting to quell any rebellious sentiment. Varys pursed his lips. However, in doing so, she will gather a large portion of her forces in an open space near the city's heart. If we time it correctly, we could stage an infiltration or sabotage. Daenerys' mind whirled. This ceremony might be an opening to strike at the heart of Cersei's power, or at least sow disarray among the Golden Company. But it could also put countless bystanders at risk. She thought of the last time King's Landing had witnessed a grand event in a religious setting, the explosion of wildfire that Cersei had unleashed, killing the High Sparrow and much of House Tyrell. She could still see the green fires in her mind's eye, recalling reports of that day. Varys sensed her hesitation. I understand your reluctance. But if the Golden Company is preoccupied with theatrics, their guard may be down in certain sectors of the walls or the keep. If we strike surgically, we might disable the Scorpions or open a gate for our forces. We need not wreak havoc on the populace. We only need to strike a blow that shows Cersei's men they aren't safe. That might force them to negotiate. Daenerys leaned back in her seat, recalling Arya's warning about living enemies. The plan was risky. A direct confrontation could spark panic, and with Cersei's track record, who knew if she had wildfire caches hidden around the city? Yet the alternative was a drawn-out blockade. How soon does the ceremony happen? Within a fortnight. My little birds are not certain of the exact day, but it will be soon. She tapped her fingers on the armrest. We need more details, precise times, guard placements, how many innocents will be present. I don't want to stage an attack if it means butchering common folk in the process. Varys nodded. I'll do my best to gather more information. But time is short. Once the Golden Company has put on their show, they'll be more vigilant. The following evenings were a blur of clandestine planning. Tyrion, Jon, Grey Worm, and others debated the merits of a stealth mission versus an overt assault. Arya joined in at one point, quietly suggesting that a small group could slip through the city's lesser-known passages, sabotage the Scorpions, and disappear before the ceremony ended. Sansa was skeptical, fearing it could provoke mass bloodshed if something went awry. Daenerys listened carefully to every angle. She disliked the thought of a covert infiltration that could lead to a violent skirmish among civilians. But if they succeeded in neutralizing the Scorpions, Drogon and Rhaegal could command the skies unimpeded, forcing Cersei to truly face her disadvantage. And if no major gate was opened, the city itself might be spared from a full-scale invasion that day. It was delicate, but it might tilt the balance. In the end, a plan took shape. Arya, skilled in the art of stealth, would lead a hand-picked team of a few trustworthy fighters, possibly including the Hound, who harbored his own vendetta against the city and its monstrous defenders. They would enter the city discreetly, using intelligence from Varys's network, move to key towers where Scorpions were mounted, sabotage or burn them, and then vanish before the alarm spread. The goal was not to slaughter guards but to quickly disable the largest threats to the dragons. Simultaneously, Daenerys would station herself just outside the city on Drogon, prepared to intervene if needed. The rest of the army would remain in camp, making no overt moves to avoid alerting Cersei prematurely. It was a gamble, and every nerve in Daenerys's body tensed at the thought of all that could go wrong. But every alternative plan carried risks as well. A siege risked starvation and untold suffering, a full assault risked unthinkable casualties. This infiltration promised at least a chance of minimal bloodshed if perfectly executed. Arya was confident, her eyes glinting in that fearless way as though she'd lived for such challenges. Jon, worried sick, tried to dissuade her, but Arya would not be denied. Sansa gave her sister a long, silent stare, then embraced her, saying only, "Come back alive." And so they prepared. Varys's informants pinpointed likely Scorpion placements. Arya studied old sewer maps, hidden alleyways, and testimonies from smugglers. The infiltration team practiced with grappling hooks, lines, and quiet kills. Daenerys oversaw final details, ensuring that if disaster struck, she could swoop in on Drogon to extract the infiltration team, though the city's labyrinth of streets would make that difficult. Tyrion paced like a caged animal, muttering dire predictions of what might happen if Cersei discovered the plan. But the day came regardless, approaching like an arrow fired by fate. On the night before the infiltration, Daenerys found Arya near the edges of the camp, checking her gear under a moonlit sky. The young woman wore dark leathers, her hair braided tightly, and had an array of daggers strapped across her torso. She was methodically testing the sharpness of each blade with a piece of cloth. The clang of hammers and the murmur of soldiers drifted from the distance. Daenerys approached quietly. "You're determined to do this?" It was not a question. Arya didn't look up from her blade. "No one else can move as I can. My face is not famous like yours or Jon's. If I fail, it will be my life, not the lives of thousands. If I succeed, we save so many from a direct assault." Daenerys nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat. She had known killers in Essos, but Arya felt different, grimly resolute, shaped by a life of loss. "Thank you. I won't forget this." Arya shrugged. Don't thank me yet. Surviving is better than gratitude. She paused, then looked up, her gaze hard but earnest. If I don't come back, promise me you'll finish this the right way. Don't burn the city for vengeance. A heavy weight settled in Daenerys's chest. She thought of the rumors, the whispers about her father's madness, the Targaryen tendency toward fire and blood. I promise, she said softly. I have no wish to be Queen of Ashes. Arya studied her a moment longer, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. She turned her attention back to her gear, dismissing Daenerys with that same quiet confidence. Daenerys left her to her preparations, returning to her own tent to finalize strategies with Jon. The plan was set. Tomorrow, the infiltration team would slip into the city just before dawn, blending with early travelers and merchants. By midday, the ceremony in the ruins of the Great September would commence, the Golden Company would be on display, and hopefully their watch on the Scorpion Towers would be lighter. Arya and her companions would strike swiftly, sabotage, or burn the siege weapons, then slip out or hide until nightfall to escape. Daenerys would wait just outside the city with Drogon. If all went well, the city's greatest defense against dragons would be crippled. If all went poorly. Daenerys did not allow herself to finish that thought. Morning arrived on a hush of anticipation. Daenerys, restless, donned her riding leathers and stepped from her tent to find the infiltration team already gone. They had departed before first light, as planned. She made her way to Jon, who stood near the picket lines with Ghost at his side. The white direwolf was watchful, though at ease around Daenerys by now. They're in the city already if everything went smoothly, Jon said, rubbing Ghost's fur absently. We can only wait now. Daenerys placed a hand on Jon's shoulder. Waiting has never been my strong suit, she murmured. He gave her a grim half-smile. Nor mine. An hour later, Daenerys mounted Drogon, soared into the sky, and took up a position on a rocky outcrop about a league north of the city's main gate. She could see the vast sprawl of King's Landing, the domes and rooftops glinting under a hazy sun. The charred ruins of the Great September of Baelor rose from the city's heart, half-collapsed walls a monument to Cersei's brutal cunning. Soldiers dotted the ramparts, and she spotted the occasional silhouette of a scorpion. She hovered at a safe distance, scanning for any sign of Arya's progress. Grey Worm led a small group of Unsullied hidden among the hills, ready to rush forward if needed. Midday came and went. Trumpets echoed from within the city, faint but discernible even at this distance. Daenerys imagined the Golden Company parading their war elephants before the crowds, Cersei perched somewhere, watching with a cruel smile. Anxiety clawed at Daenerys's chest. She forced herself to remain patient, trusting Arya's skill. The sky overhead was a dull gray, the sun obscured by drifting clouds, giving the day a muted, portentous cast. Then, faintly at first, she saw smoke curling from one of the towers near the dragon pit. Another tower along the western wall soon followed, a thin wisp rising into the sky. Her heart leaped, this had to be Arya's sabotage. She watched as smoke thickened and tiny figures on the ramparts scurried in confusion. The scorpions in those towers would be burning. A wave of alarm rippled across the city, signaled by horns. Daenerys tensed, ready to intervene if needed. Suddenly, a flash of movement near the gate caught her eye. A squad of gold-cloaked guards scurried to lock down the city's entrance. No sign of Arya or her team emerged from the gates. Daenerys's breath quickened. Could they be trapped inside? She edged Drogon forward a fraction, scanning for a better view. Bells began to toll in the city, not the bells of surrender but alarm bells, deep and resonant, stirring old tales of sackings and raids. Then a new column of smoke rose near the southwestern ramparts, accompanied by a sudden burst of flame. Likely another scorpion going up in flames, or maybe a supply of pitch igniting. Daenerys's mind raced. The infiltration was working, but if the city guard closed all exits, how would Arya and her team escape? She clung to the hope that Arya had multiple exit routes planned. Within the city, the Golden Company's parade must have erupted into chaos. She glimpsed a few war elephants stamping about in confusion near the half-ruined September, scattering crowds. A swirl of activity concentrated along the walls. Daenerys could practically feel the panic even from a league away. Yet she forced herself to hold her position. If she swooped in now, the city might interpret it as a full invasion and any chance of a negotiation might vanish in a blaze of crossbow bolts. Besides, Drogon could not easily spot the infiltration team amid the maze of streets. She might do more harm than good. The bells continued their dire tolling. Daenerys hovered, each ring a hammer blow on her nerves. She thought of the innocents within, mothers clutching children, old men trembling in corners. Cersei's men would sow fear, hunting for the saboteurs. Smoke rose in slow plumes, marking at least 3 or 4 Scorpion towers disabled, maybe more. That was significant progress. Yet the infiltration team remained unseen. An hour passed that felt like a lifetime. The city's gates stayed shut. Patrols fanned out along the battlements. The Golden Company, she guessed, had returned from their parade to assume defensive positions. Euron's fleet was nowhere in sight, presumably not in the bay at that moment. She prayed Arya had found a safe hideaway or an alternative route. Twilight began to deepen, the sky turning purple and red at the edges, and the fires from the burned towers cast an orange glow. Then, at last, movement at a smaller sally port near the southwestern side caught Daenerys' attention. A few figures slipped out hugging the shadows. It was too far to identify them clearly, but something about their stealthy approach and the way they gestured to each other made her heart pound with hope. Could that be Arya's group? She urged Drogon forward slightly, but a shout rose from the walls. A group of Lannister soldiers had spotted the escapees. Arrows arced through the air. She saw one figure crumple. Another dashed forward, returning fire with a shortbow. Daenerys bit her lip until she tasted blood. Without thinking further, she drove Drogon into a steep dive toward the southwestern walls, ignoring the alarmed shouts rising from the city's defenders. Drogon roared, spitting a plume of flame above the battlements, not directly striking them but scattering the soldiers who had aimed their bows. The city watchmen reeled back in terror, and in that moment of confusion, the small group of infiltrators broke free of the sallyport, sprinting into the scrubland outside the walls. Daenerys hovered, releasing another burst of flame high above merely as a deterrent. She could see them now, still a short distance from the city, for figures, one limping. She recognized the Hound's massive frame, a silhouette with a humped shoulder. Arya was among them, more petite, dashing with lethal grace to help a fallen comrade. Crossbow bolts hissed by, but Drogon's presence forced the archers to keep their distance. Daenerys swooped lower, flame licking across the top of the walls, causing soldiers to duck and flee. She was careful not to destroy the ramparts entirely or unleash a wildfire chain reaction. She just needed to cover Arya's escape. The infiltration team dashed into the hills, disappearing into the gathering darkness. Daenerys hovered only long enough to confirm they were out of immediate range before she veered away, returning to the vantage point by the rocky outcrop. As she did, an arrow from a scorpion near the gate soared past, missing by a wide margin. She clenched her fists, heart hammering. The scorpions that remained operational still posed a threat, and she had no desire to push her luck. With a final thunderous roar, Drogon sped away. The bells eventually ceased their clamor, leaving only the flicker of fires in the city behind her. She found Arya and her team about a mile from the city, huddled behind a rocky ridge. The Hound stood guard, battered but grim, while Arya knelt over a wounded man in black leathers. 2 others, likely northern men, panted in exhaustion. Daenerys dismounted, eyes darting to the wounded soldier. A crossbow bolt stuck from his thigh, blood pooling. Arya's face was tight with fury as she tried to stanch the bleeding. "You're alive," Daenerys breathed, relief flooding her. She knelt beside Arya. "Let me see if I can help." Arya's gaze flicked up, her usual stoicism cracked by urgency. "He needs the maester's attention." "But we succeeded, Your Grace. We destroyed at least 5 scorpions. There might be more, but that's 5 fewer to worry about." Daenerys gently pressed her palm to the soldier's wound, applying pressure. "You did well. Let's get him to camp. Missandei can fetch a healer." The Hound spat to the side. "Bloody City nearly had us. Lucky you showed up with the big lizard." Arya looked back at the city's faint lights, her jaw clenched. "Cersei's soldiers killed one of ours in the streets. We barely escaped. But we set those siege engines ablaze and the city's in chaos. It should buy you time. They'll be too busy dealing with the aftermath to launch any offense." Daenerys nodded, feeling a surge of both gratitude and sorrow for the loss of the infiltrator who hadn't made it out. War always claimed lives, even in the stealthiest operations. "We'll see you safe back at camp," she murmured, helping the wounded man onto the Hound's broad shoulder. Arya gave her a curt nod and they trudged off into the night, leaving the city behind. Sometime later, after making sure the wounded were tended and the infiltration team debriefed, Daenerys sat in her own tent, exhaustion crushing down on her. Jon entered quietly, face-etched with relief. He knelt before her, taking her hands. "They say you swooped in at the last moment to save them," he said. "You did well." She let out a shaky exhale. "I only gave them cover. They did the real work. We lost 1 man, at least. Maybe 2. Jon's grip tightened. "It's war. We can only do our best." They both sat there in silence, the tension of the day lingering in the flicker of candlelight. She could sense the shift, scorpions destroyed, the city shaken. It was a small but vital triumph, one that could tip the scales if negotiations followed. Whether Cersei would negotiate or double down on her paranoia was anyone's guess. In that hush, Daenerys recalled the dreamlike moment she had stabbed the Night King, how final and absolute that victory had felt. This was different, 1,000 shades of gray, living souls on both sides. She did not relish the blood that had been spilled, but she clung to the hope that it might spare more in the long run. Jon rose, drawing her up with him, and held her gently as the candlelight danced on the tent walls. She closed her eyes, letting herself feel the warmth of his presence, if only for a fleeting moment. Tomorrow, more decisions would press upon them, more battles of will and cunning. But for this night, at least, they had chipped away at Cersei's defenses without burning the city. It was not a grand victory song, but it was a step closer to ending a war that threatened to devour them all. Outside, in the darkness, the camp slowly settled into weary sleep. Far across the fields, King's Landing glimmered with scattered flames, the thick smoke of sabotaged scorpions drifting into the moonlit sky. And in the hush of that late hour, Daenerys Targaryen told herself that the champion of fire need not always consume everything in her path. Sometimes the slow, careful burn was enough to light the way forward, one small flame of hope in a land still scarred by endless nights.